Hey everyone, welcome back to part 3 of Daily Task Tracker. Let's do a quick recap. So we're building a daily task tracker in Laravel with a focus on architecture and security. In part 1, we laid the foundation. We designed our database, migrations, models. We set up the environment using Docker and Laravel Sail and built a custom authentication system handling everything from rate limiting to timing attacks. In part 2, we built the core business logic of the application, things like CRUD for categories and tasks, API resources, route model binding, authorization policies, and a console command for recurring tasks. We also optimized performance with chunked processing and batch inserts. Now, in part 3, we're going to prompt AI to build out the recurring tasks UI. While that's running, we're going to set up the factories and seeders to populate our database with some test data. Then we'll review and fix what the AI generates. After that, we're going to build the dashboard with Laravel Debugbar enabled to inspect queries, set up Axios for AJAX calls, and then getting to refactoring our controllers to use action classes. We'll introduce caching, modal events, and observers, and so on. Once we establish the patterns, we'll have AI apply them across the codebase. We'll also cover some security considerations, code quality tools like Pint, PHPStan, and Rector, and some AppServiceProvider settings that I add to almost every Laravel project. Just like the previous parts, this one is also filled with a ton of information, so without further ado, let's dive right in. Alright, so I'm going to press enter here. And while the Claude is polishing our UI and implementing the controller for the recurring task templates, let's talk about populating our database with some test data. We need users, categories, tasks, and we need a lot of them because we need to see how the application performs with the volume of data that reflects the real world. This is where Laravel's factories and seeders come in. Think of factories as blueprints for creating fake model instances and seeders as the scripts that use those factories to populate your database. Model factories are classes that define how to generate fake instances of your models. They use the faker library under the hood to generate the realistic fake data, things like names, emails, addresses, dates, and so on. Laravel already created the user factory for us, and factories are stored under database factories directory. And as you can see, we have that user factory here. So as you can see, the factory extends the base factory class, and it defines a method called definition. The definition method is where we define the default state of our model. Something to note here is that the mass assignment protection is automatically disabled when using factories, so you don't need to worry about fillable or guarded in here. The fake helper function here gives us access to faker's method. So the fake name here, this generates names like John Doe or Jane Smith. Safe email generates email addresses with domain like example.com. The unique modifier ensures that we never generate duplicate emails, and so on. Notice the static password caching in here. This is kind of a performance optimization because hashing passwords is an expensive operation. So instead of hashing this password every single time we create the user record with the default values from this factory, we hash it once and store it in the static property, so that way the next user that gets created from this factory with the default password, it takes the cached password instead of hashing it again. Then if we scroll down here, we have this unverified method, and this is a state method. The unverified method here defines an alternative state for the factory. By default, users are verified because email verified at is set to now. So when we create users using the user factory, by default, they will all be verified. But if we wanted to create users that are not verified, we can have an alternate state, and that's where we define different kind of methods here. So any other method that we define here, they can be states. And in order for the method to be a state, we just need to return this state and pass the closure here. And the closure essentially returns the attributes that we want to update for that state. And in this case, email verified at needs to be set to null to have a user that's not verified. So essentially, states let us create variations of our models without duplicating a lot of the code. Now, you could also simply pass the email verified at null directly when creating a new user from this factory, but having states make it kind of more readable, and it gives you a bit more control and flexibility if you have some additional logic that goes in with a specific state. So now let's use this factory to create a user. So we'll open the terminal and let's start the Tinker session. So we'll do PHP artisan Tinker. And then within Tinker, let's use the factory to create a new user. So we'll do user, call factory statically on it, and then call create on it. If we press enter, we see that the user was automatically aliased to the model, the user model, and then the user was created. So if we now open the database and open the users, we see that the new user was created in here. If we run it again, we see another user was created, and so on. We can create multiple users by specifying the count. So we can say, hey, let's create 10 users. We press enter. And now, as you can see, it returns the collection of the users that it has created. If I refresh this, we see that now we have 10 more users than we did before. Alternatively, if you don't want to call the count, you could simply specify the count within here when calling the factory method. And this is going to do the same thing. We could also create the models without persisting them to the database by calling the make method instead of create. So let's say we want to create a user model but don't persist it, maybe make some changes to it and then persist it. We can call make, and this is simply going to return the user model, but it is not going to update the database. So we have the 23 rows. If I refresh, we still have 23 rows. Now you might be wondering how come we are able to call the factory statically on the user model. And that's because we have the has factory trait on the models. So if we open the user model here and scroll down, we see that we have this has factory trait. This trait is the one that provides the factory method that gives us access to the model's factory. So if we inspect that, we see that we have that static factory method here, and so on. Laravel uses a simple convention to figure out which factory class to use. It looks for the factory class in the database factories namespace that matches your model name with the factory appended to it. So the user model will look for the user factory in the database factories, and if it finds it, that's the factory class that it's going to use. Now, if the factory doesn't follow the naming convention, you can use the use factory attribute to explicitly specify which factory to use. So we can do use factory and then specify which factory class we want to use. In this case, maybe we had user factory but stored somewhere else. We would specify it here, and then now the user model, when calling the factory statically, would use this factory class. Alternatively, if you don't want to use the use factory and the has factory trait here, but still want to make use of the factories, you could simply reference the factory directly. So we could do something like user factory and then call new, and this is going to create the new instance of that factory. And then we can simply say, hey, create another user. And if we do that, we see that it has created another user. So if we refresh this now, we have 24 users. All right, so now let's create the factory classes for our category, task, and the recurring task models. So we'll do PHP artisan make factory, category, factory, and let's do the same for the task factory and the same for the recurring task factory. Then we need to add the has factory to our models. So let's open the category model and we'll add use has factory. And let's do the same thing in the task model and in the recurring task model. Now let's start filling in these factories. So in the category factory, we need to specify the name, and the name can be fake and maybe some words, maybe random words of up to 3. So we'll do rand 1 3. We want these words to be as one string, so let's pass true here as the second argument. Then we also need the user ID. And since this is a relationship, we can actually use the user factory in here so that whenever the category is created, the default user that gets associated with that category, if we don't provide the user ID, will be the new user that Laravel will automatically create using that factory. So we can do simply something like user factory. Now we should be able to create categories using this factory. So if we open the terminal and start the Tinker session, we should be able to do something like category factory and create. And this has created a new category with some random name, the user ID, and so on. And if we open the users table again, we see that it has added a new user because we did not specify the user ID, so it used the default user, and in this case it essentially uses the user factory to create the new user record for us. If we wanted to specify the user or any other columns for the category when we're creating the category using the factory, we can simply pass an array here and say name equals test and user ID equals maybe to 1. If we press enter, we see that it has created a factory with the name and user ID that we passed. We could also specify the relationship outside of specifying the user ID by calling a method called for and passing the user record. So if we pass a model here, it will automatically figure out which relationship that is and assign it properly as long as you follow the standard conventions. So in here, the for method basically uses the belongs to relationship for the model that's passed. Now I don't have the user variable here, but I could simply do something like user find and find the user model, and this is going to work. So if we hit enter, we see that it works. If we wanted to create a new user on the fly, we could simply pass the factory like that, and it's going to create a new user. Now let's fill in the task factory here. I'm going to fill in these quick. So we have the user ID and the category ID. By default, we'll just new up those models as needed if we're not provided the specific user or the category IDs. By default, we're not going to mark this task to be a recurring task, so it's not going to have a recurring task ID. We're going to have some kind of title, the description, task date, which will pick a random date between these two dates, and then completed that will be null. Now for this, it makes sense to have different states for the tasks. We may want to have a state for a recurring task. We may want to create a task that was created from a recurring task template. So we could do something like this. Now we could have simply used the relationships to create the relationship between the task and the recurring task, but this state essentially allows us to set other attributes as well, like the user ID, the category ID, title, and description, so that it makes more sense that this task was actually created from a recurring task template because their title, the category, the user ID, and everything else matches. Then we can have a state for completed tasks. We can have a state for tasks that don't have a category, tasks that are due today, and tasks that are overdue where the task date is in the past. So I'm just going to paste in those methods in here to speed this up, and I'll go over some of the items in here that I think are important. For example, the sentence here is generating a sentence between 3 to 8 words. The description here is a paragraph where with this optional method and the zero point 0.7 or the 70% weight, which essentially means that 70% of the time it is going to generate the description and 30% of the time it will be null. This mimics real world usage where not every task has a description. This, as I mentioned, just picks the random date between the two given dates, but if you provide a string like this, minus 30 days plus 30 days, this also works, and in this case, it essentially gives 60-day window to pick a random date from. This way, we get kind of a mix of past, present, and future tasks. Now, if we go back to the Tinker session, we could create tasks that are more realistic. So we could do something like task factory today completed create. So as you can see, the completed at now is set and task is set for today. We could create a task that's overdue. So we'll do overdue without category, hit enter. Oh, we need to create it. So let's add create. And as you can see, it created a task without the category and the task date is in the past. So as you can see, this is more expressive and easier to read than passing a bunch of attributes in here. All right, so now let's fill in the recurring task factory. We're gonna have the user ID and the category ID the same way. Same for the title and description. The frequency will set it to daily by default. And let's actually use the enum in here. The frequency config, we're gonna keep it as null by default. The start date will be the current date and we will have no end date by default. Now we can have some state methods here. So in this case, it makes sense to have states like daily, weekdays, weekly, monthly, and maybe with some kind of end date. So I'm going to paste in some of these state methods here. So for daily, we're specifying the frequency to be daily. Again, I'll change this to use the enum class that we created. For the weekdays, we'll change it to weekdays. And for weekly, we'll change it to weekly. And for monthly, we'll change it to monthly. And this one just specifies the end date for the recurring task template. Now, if we open the terminal and restart our Tinker, we should be able to create recurring task templates using our factory. So we could do something like create a daily recurring task template. And as you can see, that works. We have a frequency set to daily and the config is null. We can create a recurring task that is for weekdays. We can do a recurring task that's for weekly on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And as you can see, that works as expected. We could also create a recurring task that ends in 6 months. And we see that it works. And we could create a recurring task for a specific user by specifying that user relationship. So we'll do for and do user find one for this example, and we see that it works. Now, factories are great for creating individual models, but seeders are where we orchestrate the creation of those models in mass. You don't want to go to Tinker and start creating these factories manually for each of your models. Seeders are essentially what will help you orchestrate that and create a lot of data for your environments. Seeders are classes that run in a specific order to populate the database with the test data. So let's look at the current database seeder class. As you remember, we added this to create a bunch of categories initially. This works, but it is not great. We're hard coding the user ID, we're not using the factory, and we're only creating categories. We're not creating anything else. So let's refactor this properly. First, instead of dumping all the logic inside the database seeder, let's create dedicated seeder classes for each model. This makes our code more organized and maintainable. So we'll do something like PHP artisan make seeder, user seeder, and then we'll do the same thing for the task seeder. Seeders are stored under the database seeders directory. So let's open the user seeder. As you can see, this extends some base seeder class and provides a method definition for a method called run. Now within this method, we can put our logic to create bunch of users. And this is where we can use the factories. So we can do something like create a test user with a known password in case we wanted to log in with that user at some point. And then we can also say that we want to create 9 more users afterwards. So this means that we'll have total of 10 users when we run the seeder. Notice that I'm not calling the hash password in here. That's because this will automatically be hashed due to Laravel's casting. So if we open the user model, we have the casts here where the password is being cast to hashed, and Laravel will automatically hash the password for us. Now you could still hash it yourself if you wanted to. It's not going to double hash, but if you forget to hash, Laravel will automatically handle that for you. All right, so let's create the category seeder as well. So we'll do category seeder. Let's open that up. And in here, we're going to create maybe 25 to 50 categories for each user. So first, we need to get all the users. So we'll do users equal user all. And then we'll do for each user, we want to create 25 to 50 categories. So we'll do category factory. We'll do count random 25 to 50 for user and call create. Now let's do the task seeder. In here, we're gonna do the same thing where we'll iterate over each user, and for each user's categories, we're going to create maybe 30 or 50 regular tasks, and then maybe we'll create some completed tasks and maybe some overdue tasks to kind of mimic the realistic scenarios. So we'll do the same thing here, users equals user all. Then we'll do for each users get the categories. And notice this is going to cause n+1 problem here because we are trying to query the categories for each user. So if we have 100 users, we're going to execute 100 queries. We are querying all the users first, which could be 10 or 100 or 1000 users. And then for each of those users, we are executing another query to fetch the categories, and that's the n queries. Now, how can you spot the n+1 problems? It kind of is pretty obvious at some degree, but it can be pretty tricky and hard to spot in certain scenarios. The pattern is usually you fetch a collection of models, the one query, and then inside a loop over that collection or over that list, you access a relationship that was not eager loaded, and that's the n queries. You can spot these by using tools like Laravel Debugbar or Telescope. These tools show you all the database queries, or you can log the database queries and then see them in the logs. If you see the same query repeated with the different IDs, that typically means that it has n+1 problem. This also is called lazy loading. It simply means that relationships are loaded on demand, only when you access them, which might be convenient because you don't need to load all the relationship data you might not need, but it causes that n+1 problem when you access relationships inside loops. The solution to n+1 problem is eager loading, as you saw before. We can load the relationships upfront in a single query. we can use a method called with. So we could do user with categories and then call get on it. And this way we execute only two queries, one to get the users and the other to get the associated categories. And we don't have the n+1 problem anymore. Then when you fetch the categories within the loop for each user record, Laravel automatically pulls the categories from the eager loaded list. You can also eager load multiple relationships by passing an array and having a comma separated list. So instead of just categories, we could have user with categories, comma, tasks, or you can have nested relationships and so on. So continuing here, we can say task factory. We want to create 30 to 50 tasks for this user. We can also assign the category to this task at a random. We can pick a random category from this list and assign it to this task. So we can do something like for categories random. Then let's also create a few tasks that don't have any categories. So we'll do task factory and say count maybe between 5 and 10 tasks for this user, but set the category ID to null. Actually, we have the without category state, I think. So instead of this, we can do without category, and this should work. Then let's also create some tasks that are completed and some tasks that are overdue. So we'll take this and clone it here, and then we'll do completed, and maybe we'll only do between 10 and 20 tasks. And then let's do the same thing, but do overdue. And maybe we'll only do 5 to 10 overdue tasks. Now you could get as creative as you want here. You could alternate the different statuses, like have some tasks that don't have the category but were completed, tasks that don't have the category and are overdue, and so on. And you can play around with the different kinds of logic if you wanted to. There are many other features available to factories that you can look into the documentation for. For example, one such really good feature is sequences. If you want to alternate different kind of values for different models that get created from the factories. And I think this is good enough for now. Let's also create the recurring task seeder. So we'll do recurring task seeder. And in the recurring task seeder, we're gonna do pretty much the same thing we're doing here. So let's copy this and put it in here. The difference here will be that we want to create recurring tasks with various frequencies. So we kind of want to pick random frequencies for different recurring tasks and maybe for different users. Now we can pick the random frequency from the available frequencies this way. So we can do something like frequency equals task frequency cases. This is going to return an array of all the cases, and then we can pick the random element from this array. So first let's move this in here. So we'll do frequencies equals this, and then we can do something like fake random element and pass frequencies. Then we need to decide which state to call on the recurring task factory, because if the random frequency that gets picked here is weekly or monthly, we also need the configuration for it, right? So we can use the match expression for that. So we can do something like match frequency, and then if the matched frequency is daily, then we can simply call recurring task factory to create the recurring task model. And by default, we are creating the daily recurring tasks. In fact, let's move this outside here like this and simply set it this way. Then if we have weekly, we're going to call weekly on it. If we have monthly, we're going to call monthly. For weekly, we need to pass the days that we want these tasks to be recurring for, whether it's like Monday, Tuesday, or every Wednesday, and so on. We can also pick a random one from that, but for now, I think we're just going to keep it simple and say we want it to be recurring on every Monday, which is the default value. Same goes for monthly. We're going to keep it simple and say to have it recur on the first day of the month. We also need the case here for the weekdays. So we'll do task frequency weekdays, and this will be weekdays. And here actually we can call daily this way. So it's a bit more consistent. Now we can also set the category for this recurring task to be random. So we'll do for categories random. And finally, we'll call create. All right, so now that we have the seeders, let's set up the orchestration through the database seeder class. So in here, we're going to get rid of these, and we can simply call a method called call, and this accepts an array of seeders that we want to execute in order. So we'll do user seeder first, then we'll do category seeder, task seeder, and recurring task seeder. Now, in order to run all the seeders, we simply need to run dbseed artisan command. So we can do something like phpartisan dbseed, and this is going to run through all the seeders specified in the database seeder. If we wanted to run it for a specific seeder, we could specify class task seeder, for example, and it will only execute this seeder. We could also run the seeders right after we reset the database. So if we were running something like migrate fresh, we could add -- seed, and it's going to start fresh, reset all the tables, and then seed the database. So let's run the seeder for now to make sure that it is working. So I'm going to run the user seeder for now. Let's run that. Not the make seeder, we need to run it. So it's php artisan db seed and class user seeder. It worked. If we open the users table, we have 10 more users. If we run it again, we see that we get an error that the user already exists with this email address. Now let's run the category seeder. And it's taking a while because I have a lot of users right now. We have 48 users, and it's essentially creating 25 to 50 categories for each user. So if we refresh this table now, we have over 1700 categories. Now let's run the PHP Artisan migrate fresh and do seed. So the user and the category seeder is executed, but the task seeder is throwing an error. Start date must be anterior to end date. So if we go to task factory 47, the completed at, we are using date time between the task date and now, and task date sometimes can be in future, and if that's the case, this doesn't make sense. What we need to do in this case is that we need to ensure that task date is in fact in the past and not in the future. So we can take this and update it here to ensure that it is within the last 30 days. And we can take this and assign it to a variable, and we can turn this into a non-arrow function, so that way we can have some logic in here. So we'll do return. Let's format the code. And here we can do task date equals to this, and we'll replace this here. Now this should work. So let's run it again. And as you can see, now all the seeders worked without any issues. So if we open the users, we have the 20 users, and I think it should be 10. I think we have an issue in the recurring task seeder. So if we open that up here, we're not specifying the user relation, so it essentially loops through all the users, which we have 10 users, and it creates recurring tasks. And then for each recurring task, it creates a new user. And in this case, it creates 10 users because we're creating 10 recurring tasks. So we need to fix two things here. First, we want to create a few recurring tasks, not just one for each user. So maybe we need some kind of loop here. So we'll do something like for I equals 0, I less than 20, I plus plus, and let's specify the user here. So we'll do for user, and now it should create these recurring tasks for this user. So each user gets about 20 recurring tasks. In fact, maybe we can set this to some kind of random number between 1 and 10, and we'll do this less than or equal to. So it's going to pick a number between 1 and 10. So at max, we'll have 20 recurring tasks for the user, and otherwise we may have only 10 recurring tasks for a user, depending on what the random number here is. In fact, maybe let's bump this to 15. So some users may have 5 recurring tasks, some users may have 10, and so on. So let's run this again. Let's check the users now, and sure enough, now we have only 10 users. Let's check the categories, and we have 347 categories. Let's check tasks, and we have 687 tasks, and the recurring tasks, we have 154 recurring tasks. All right, I think that's good enough for now. We could play around with more seeders and set up more logic to create more realistic data, but this is good enough for now. We can run these seeders manually. We can run the factories manually to bump up the volume of the data that we have for various testing reasons. All right, so with that, let's move on to review the UI that Claude Code has generated for us and the controller for the recurring task CRUD management. So we're going to log in with the test user that we created through our seeder, test@example.com, and password is password. Let's go to tasks. And as you can see, we have the data populated here. This is from the seeders that we ran that use the database factories. And we have a new button here called recurring tasks. So if we go in here, we see that we have some recurring tasks that were created. We can add new recurring tasks. We can delete and edit recurring tasks. As you can see, the task was deleted successfully. Let's try to delete one more. Let's try to edit this task. So I'm just going to prefix it with test. We have the title, description, the category dropdown, the frequency dropdown, start date and end date, which are optional. And if we select weekly or monthly, we will see additional fields. So for weekly, we see checkboxes that we can select like Monday, Wednesday. For monthly, we need to add the day of the month that we want this recurring task to recur on. So let's set it to weekly for now and update this recurring task template. And sure enough, it was updated, and we see that schedule now is Monday, Wednesday on weekly basis. We can create the new task, and the same form shows up here. So we can do test, test. We can select the category, the frequency. Let's set it to monthly this time. And let's create this recurring task template. And sure enough, we see that it worked. All right, so seems like Claude did a pretty good job on setting up this UI for us as well as the backend to be able to manage the recurring task templates. If we try to add a new task, we no longer see that checkbox to make this recurring, which is expected because we can create recurring tasks from another page now. All right, so before we build the dashboard, let's review the code to make sure that whatever Claude did is acceptable to us. And if we need to make some changes, we can make them now, or we can make those changes later on. So let's go in here, and I'm going to simply review the diff here. So first we have this xcloak on the app.css. I believe this is the Alpine.js thing. It is needed to make some flashing screens go away, like if you refresh a page and you're trying to show and hide things based on different selections, like in the dropdown for the frequency dropdown. To avoid that little flashiness, I think this is what that solves. So we add the xcloak attribute to the HTML element and we mark it to be display none. It essentially hides the element that it is attached to until the Alpine is fully loaded on the page. Then it seems like Claude Code has created reusable components here, especially the one for category select, which makes sense, so it's not duplicating this div with listing the categories in a dropdown across multiple views, because you would have to repeat this in the recurring task templates when editing and adding a new template, and also within the tasks. And seems like it modified the tasks blade as well, which is right here. It removed the duplication and it uses the component that it created. So then we have the create recurring task template blade view file here, which is a standard form. I'm assuming this is very similar or almost identical to the create tasks view. Then it updated the create tasks view and it replaced this duplication with the component. And it also removed that is recurring checkbox from this view. Then we have the edit recurring task template form, and then it updated the edit tasks view, again removing the is recurring and reusing the component here. Then it created a frequency select dropdown, which is used inside the create and edit recurring task template views. This is the recurring task templates index page, which lists or displays all the recurring tasks in a table as well as the buttons on the top. Again, it's very similar to the tasks index page. Then we have the tasks index page that was updated to have the recurring tasks button at the top. And I believe that's it here. No, it removed the recurring column from the table. Then we have a reusable component for the day of the month, and as you can see, we have that xcloak attribute in here. Then on the recurring task model, I don't remember if I added this or if Claude decided to fix it, but we were missing the root key name to be UUID. Then we have the recurring task controller, which I'll go through in a bit in more detail, but let's look at the policy. So in the policy is similar to the other policies. It checks if the user of the recurring task is the same user as the currently logged in user. We have the recurring task resource. We are returning the UUID, title, description, the category only if it's loaded, frequency, the frequency config, start and end dates, and then created and updated dates. All right, then we have the store recurring task form request. So we have the title, description, category ID, frequency, days. The frequency has to be one of the enum values, so that's a good one. The days can be excluded unless the frequency is set to weekly. That's what this exclude unless does. It is required if the frequency is weekly, and then it needs to be an array with a minimum of one value. So it has to be either one of these values. Then this rule here essentially checks to make sure that the individual array items that are being passed here are one of these values. Then day of the month can be excluded unless the frequency is monthly. If it's frequency monthly, then it is required, it has to be integer, and between 1 and 31. The start and end dates are nullable, they need to be dates, and the end date needs to be after or equal to start date. All right, so I think that's pretty good. The task model, there is not much changes in here. We removed the is recurring from the task and task resource. Update recurring task form request is similar to the store recurring task request. Then the user model now has the recurring tasks relationship, and we have the routes. So we have the resourceful routes for the recurring tasks, except the show method. The parameters method here is trying to override the parameter name. So it's essentially trying to set the parameter name to recurring task for recurring tasks. The thing is, this is not necessary because I believe it is set to recurring task regardless. So if we open a terminal and we run PHPArtisan route list, we see that it is recurring task because we're overriding it. But if we comment this out and we run it again, we see that it's still a recurring task. And to be sure, we can do PHPArtisan route clear to be sure that it's not cached and then run route list. We see that it's still recurring underscore task. So I'm not sure why it decided to add this. I would maybe consider it having it but making it camel case. But I assume on the front end, it is doing the recurring underscore task. But I think this is fine. We'll just keep it the way it is. I'm actually going to remove this and just keep it consistent because we don't have that anywhere else. All right, let's continue. So we also have that reusable component here called weekly days. And this is the checkboxes that it displays for each day of the week. All right, so I think the code looks okay. Let's review the controller quick here. So we have the index, we're loading the recurring tasks, we are eager loading the categories, and we're only loading the user's recurring tasks. We are loading the categories, and we're passing that down to the view, as well as the links for pagination. Then for create, we are loading the categories, and I think we will optimize this at some point because we're doing it in multiple places now, not just in the task controller, but we're also doing it in the recurring task controllers. So we'll refactor this to make it a bit better. Then we have the store method. We're checking the category ID properly here. If the given category ID from the request does not belong to the current user, it is throwing an exception. Then we're building the frequency config and setting it on the data. We are removing the days and day of the month because we don't need days and day of the month to be part of data anymore because they will be part of the frequency config. So that's what this build frequency config does. And yeah, it gets the frequency from the request. Then it checks the frequency to see if it's the weekly or the monthly. If it is weekly, it checks if the request has days. And if it does, returns the days. And then if it's monthly, it returns the day of the month. Now, I'm not sure I am happy with just getting it this way. Maybe we should just pass the validated list of data to this instead of the request and get it from there. So we'll pass the data and then we'll go here and we'll say we have array data, and this way we can later move this method somewhere else instead of having it in the controller, and we don't have to depend on the request object. We can depend on some kind of array or even a DTO if we wanted to go a step further. So we'll just get the data here and we'll say that we'll get the data and we'll just get the frequency from this data because we know that frequency will be set on the data since it's part of the form request. So we see here the frequency is a required field, so it will always be set. So let's go in here and we get the frequency, and then same thing here, we'll just simply do isset data days and get it this way, and do the same thing here. So we'll do isset data day of month, and if it's set, we will get it this way. Just a slight refactoring. So let's continue here. Once we remove that, we just pass it directly to the create method on the user's recurring tasks to create the recurring task for that user. And we redirect the user with the success message. The edit controller method just loads the category and passes the list of categories to the view, as well as the frequencies for the dropdown to display it, and passes the recurring task resource. Then the update method does similar to what the store method was doing. It checks for the category access, the proper access, making sure that the user can access the category that user is trying to set. And It does the same thing for the frequency config. So we need to pass instead of request the data here. And then it calls the fill method passing the data and calls the save on the recurring task. The destroy simply deletes the recurring task. So let's make sure that whatever changes we made actually didn't break anything. So I'm going to delete this. Let's create another one. We'll select maybe weekly frequency and set it to Thursday and Monday. Create, that works. Let's try to edit it. Let's change it to daily, update, and that works. Let's change it to monthly, and that works. And I think this is pretty good. I think Claude did a good job on this. I'm going to keep it. We'll come back and refactor and clean it up later on. I'm planning to do some refactoring, like cleaning this up, putting it into maybe services or actions so that we don't have controllers cluttered up with a lot of logic. Maybe deduplicate some of the code here, like I said, with the category loading, or even this checking access to the category, because we're doing it in 4 places now. We're doing it 2 in the recurring task controller and 2 in the task controller. So it would be good if we extracted this into some reusable logic that we could call from all of these places. And we'll get to that. I first want to get to the finish line, and then we'll do some fun refactoring. All right, so with that, let's move on to the dashboard. Now, for the dashboard, I want to build something where we will have kind of like a statistic cards on the front. So we'll have like maybe 3 or 4 statistic cards that show you maybe some overdue tasks, the tasks that have been completed today, maybe total tasks completed last 7 days, and things like that. Then below that, maybe we can show something like any overdue tasks that we haven't completed from yesterday or the day before. If we left some task incomplete, maybe we need to show that in some kind of section and highlight it that these are overdue tasks so that the user completes them. And then on the right side of it, we can show the tasks that are for today. I don't want to overcomplicate it. We'll try to keep it simple. And we're going to have Claude build it out. I don't want to write a lot of the UI code here. We pretty much covered everything that was needed. I think we can have Claude take it from here, and then I will review what Claude does and adjust it if needed. So I'm just going to do that behind the scenes and come back once Claude is ready with the dashboard code, and we'll review and see how it did. All right, so Claude has finished implementing our dashboard. So as you can see, we have the dashboard controller, the dashboard blade template that have been updated. And if we review the changes, we see that we have 2 new components here. One is the stat card component, and the other one is task list. We're going to go over these in just a bit and also see in the UI what it did. Now, before I go over to the UI, I want to refresh our database because we made some changes and so on. So we're just going to run PHPStan migrate fresh and then do seed. So we reseed the database tables. And once that's done, let's switch over to the browser. We're going to log in with the test example user. And as you can see, we have a dashboard that looks pretty nice if you ask me. So we have the current date displayed in here. As you can see, it's been quite a while since I recorded the last session. Then we have the new task button, which I assume if we click, we go to the new task page, and we do. We have the 4 statistic cards as we described in the prompt. We have number of tasks completed today. And it seems like this is listing 0 out of 1 because there is 1 task that's for today and it hasn't been completed. Then we have 29 overdue tasks. So we have some tasks that were created in the past from our seeder and they were never marked as completed. We have 53 total incomplete tasks, and we have 7 total completed tasks within the last 7 days. And it seems like we can mark these as completed as well. So if we click on that, it is marking it as completed, and as you can see, the overdue tasks are decreasing, and then total pending is decreasing as well. We can complete the one for today, and now this got updated, 100% completed. Let's just go through these all just to see if this section disappears, because we had that in the prompt as well. And sure enough, it does, and we have upcoming tasks only. Maybe if we are not showing the overdue tasks, we would make this full screen here, but I think this is okay for now. It also added this cool quick actions section, which are just the navigation buttons that take you to various sections to the page. So this one takes us to the all tasks. This one, I would assume it selects the filter on the tasks. So if we go here, yeah, it selects the incomplete filter. So we have all the incomplete tasks in here. And you might be asking how come these are not in the part of overdue tasks. That's because those 23 incomplete tasks are for future. It's part of our seeder that selected the task date in the future, and they're not completed. So that's why they're incomplete tasks. They're not for today, and they're not overdue either. They're simply tasks that we haven't gotten to yet. All right, so I think it did a pretty good job. So now let's go over to the code and review to see what the code actually looks like. So the first thing that it's doing is getting the statistics in the stats array, and this is used for that stat cards that we saw, the first 4 cards on the dashboard. So we have the tasks today, completed today, overdue, and total pending. Now, this is running 4 queries here. I would personally do this in one query. It is possible to get all of this using one query, and we will optimize this later on. So we're going to keep it this way for now, and then later I'll show you how we can make this into a single query. Then down here we have total completion rate, which is the percent rate. So it takes the completed tasks and divides it by the tasks for today, multiplying by 100, and rounds it to get the percent value. Then it is querying the upcoming tasks. It is eager loading the categories, which is good. It's checking where between the task date is between today and tomorrow, and where completed at is null. It is only getting the 10 upcoming tasks. I assume this is because we want to limit how many upcoming tasks we display at a time. Now, this might be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your requirements. You may want to show all the upcoming tasks and just paginate on the dashboard, or you might just want to show the first 10 tasks. This one is ordering by the task date, but since the task date is just a date, not a date time, and we may have many tasks that are for the same day, this is not really going to order properly. So what we need to order it by is the task date, and then maybe we can also order by created at. This way, the tasks that were created first for the same day will be shown on top. Then we're getting the overdue tasks. It is also eager loading the categories where null completed at, where date is less than today, and it also orders by task date, and let's also order by the created at the same way here. We get the 5 overdue tasks, and then we have recent completions, which checks where completed at is null and where completed at is within the last 7 days. All right, so let's format the code in here, and let's look at the UI. On the dashboard, we're displaying the today's date in this format. We're adding that button in here. Then we're displaying the tasks for today component. So it is using that stat card component, which is a reusable component, and that's pretty good that it did that and it didn't duplicate a lot of the HTML in here. That way we're passing the title, the stats, the trend, and the color, and it handles the display. And it also displays the icon, seems like. Then we also have the tasks list display here for the overdue and the upcoming tasks, and it also uses a reusable component, task list in this case. It's passing the 4 props, the title, the tasks, empty message, and variant And then on the bottom, we have the quick links. So this is just showing links to various pages. All right, so that's pretty simple, I think. So let's quickly inspect these components. So we're gonna open the stat card and then the task list. And it's pretty self-explanatory in here. Looks like we can also go into individual tasks to edit, which is pretty good that I didn't realize. So if we go here, let's add a new task for today. Go to dashboard. Then if we hover over this, yeah, so these are links. So I would probably maybe enhance the UI here to make it clear that these are clickable. So if we click, it just takes us to edit that task, which is pretty cool. All right, so now that we have our dashboard working, even though it's kind of minimalistic, let's talk about some potential optimizations and performance debugging that you might need to do in your Laravel applications. How many database queries are we actually running when we visit the dashboard or when we try to edit a task and so on? Are we loading more data than we actually need? These are the questions that are not so trivial to answer just by reading the code. We need some kind of tools. And some of my favorite tools to answer these kind of questions are Laravel Debugbar along with Telescope and Clockwork. We're going to be installing Laravel Debugbar in this project. Laravel Debugbar is a development package that adds a toolbar to your application that shows you everything that's happening under the hood. I personally use Telescope or Clockwork because I typically don't use Blade for view rendering and work with an API layer like GraphQL or REST API and then the React on the front end, but in some cases I use Debugbar as well. Alright, so we're gonna install the Debugbar using Composer. So that's Composer require Laravel Debugbar, and we'll install that as a dev dependency because it's a development only tool and you don't want it in production, because it could expose sensitive information and also slow things down. All right, once that's installed, let's go to the browser, refresh the page, and as you can see, we have the debug bar showing right here. It is showing the requests, the views, the queries, models, and so on. So if we click on queries, we see all the queries that are being executed in here. If we click on models, we see all the models that have been hydrated on the dashboard. If we go to messages, we see that these are the messages from our log file. If we go to views, we can see all the Blade views that are being rendered in here. So we have the dashboard, we have the stat card being rendered 4 times because we have 4 cards. We have the task list, the layout, navigation, etc. Now, if we look at the queries, we see that we're executing 10 queries, which is not too bad, but it can be better. Like I said, we are executing these 4 queries here that we can bring it down to 1 query. So that's -3 queries that we could optimize here. And then maybe we could optimize some of the other things as well. But what I want to do is I want to rerun the database seeder again, so that we have some overdue tasks and so on, to make sure that there is nothing crazy going on in terms of number of queries, to make sure we don't have n+1 query and so on. All right, let's refresh here. Let's log in. So we have testexample.com, password, login, and we have 11 queries and 11 models. So as you can see, now we're loading more models than before because we have the 5 overdue tasks and 3 upcoming tasks. So total is 8. So we see the 8 tasks here. We have 2 categories because only 2 unique categories are associated with the rendered tasks here. We have 1 category right here and 1 category right here. If these tasks all had different categories, it would load more category models in here. And it's hydrating the user model because we are logged in as a user. All right, so I think this is not too bad. We could certainly optimize it, but I don't think this is terrible. Then we go to tasks. Here we are running 6 queries. The sessions and users, this is kind of a given. We need to run these queries because it's for user authentication. So we have 4 additional queries here. One is to get the total from the tasks. Then we are actually getting the tasks with pagination. And we're getting the categories and then getting the category name and UUID. This is for the dropdown. On edit, we can see a new tab here called gate. And if we click on that, this is the policy that we are using on editing the task. So we're making sure that only the user that can manage this task can actually access this page. Let's go to the categories page. And nothing crazy here. We're loading 15 category models because we have 15 models displayed here. And we are executing 2 additional queries on top of the user authentication. Let's go to the recurring tasks, and nothing crazy here as well. We have the 13 recurring tasks, 10 categories, and 1 user. The other thing that I want to optimize is this query right here. As you notice, we're calling this query on multiple pages. So we're on the tasks page, we're getting that query. If we go to edit page, we're calling that query because of the dropdown. If we go to create new task, we're calling that query. And if we go to recurring tasks, we're calling that query. And the same applies to new recurring task and the edit recurring task as well. So that's a lot of times where we are calling this query. And it's a potential optimization because categories don't change often, right? User sets up the categories and usually it's set in and forget it, right? You don't add categories that often. So it's a prime candidate for caching and maybe just executing it one time and then everywhere else we load it from cache. So we are not executing extra query. And then we need to make sure that we bust the cache whenever a new category gets created, category gets updated or deleted. But we're going to do that a bit later. For now, I want to move our attention to making AJAX calls because right now when we toggle a task completion status from either the dashboard or from within the tasks page, we're doing a full form submission. The page does a full page reload. So if you notice, if I click this, this will refresh right here. So if we click that, as you can see, it does a full page reload. It may not be noticeable because it's pretty fast, but it still does the full page reload. Now, the page reloads sometimes are okay, but it may also not be the smoothest experience in certain cases. So we can refactor this easily to use AJAX with Axios. So tasks can be completed instantly without a page refresh. And this will work on both the dashboard and the tasks page using the same JavaScript method. So let's go back to code. And I'm going to close these out from here. And we'll open the resources JavaScript directory. Now, Laravel already includes Axios in its default setup and installation. You can see it configured within the bootstrap.js file. As you can see, it makes Axios available on the window object, and it sets the X requested with header in here. The thing is, instead of using the window Axios, I want to create a dedicated HTTP client module. This will give us a clean place to configure things like interceptors for centralized error handling and so on. So we'll create a new file within the resources.js directory. We'll call it http.js. And we're going to import Axios here from Axios. And then we're going to use the Axios create method to create the Axios instance. So we'll do const http equals axios.create. We can set the same headers that Laravel was setting it here. So we want to set X requested with header with the XML HTTP request value. So we'll just do it this way. Then once we have this set up, we can do export default HTTP. Then once we have the instance, we can add interceptors. And interceptors are functions that essentially let you intercept the request of responses on the Axios before they're handled by the then or catch blocks. It kind of acts like a middleware essentially. So In our case, it can be useful because we may want to handle common errors in one place instead of repeating error handling everywhere in our JavaScript. So we could do something like HTTP interceptors response and use. On error, we want to do something like this. So we're gonna first check for network errors. If the error response is undefined, that could mean that the request was unable to connect or reach the server. Maybe the user lost internet connection or something. So we can handle such scenario before checking for any specific HTTP status code. So we can do something like if not error response alert unable to connect to the server. And then we can return promise reject error. Then after that, we can get the HTTP status from the response. So we can do const status equals error response status. And then we can do either the if else check or a switch statement. So we'll do switch status and then provide cases for different status codes. So for example, for 401, that essentially means that the session expired or user was logged out, so we need to redirect the user to login page. So we'll simply do window location href equals / login and break. Then we can have another case to handle maybe 419 status code, which is essentially CSRF token mismatch from Laravel. And if we get that error, maybe we need to reload the page, so we reinitialize the CSRF token. So we'll do case 419 window location reload break. For validation status code like 422, I think individual components should handle that and figure out how to display inline error messages and things like that. I don't want to provide a global error handler in here for validation errors. Now, I would do that if we had something like a toast library or something that would show a notification on a page when errors come in. But since we're not using any of those packages or libraries, we're just going to keep it simple. Otherwise, I would add the case 422 in here and parse the validation errors and then display the notification with the proper validation error. But that essentially depends on the project requirements. In this case, we don't need to do that. So we'll just add a case for 500. And in this case, we're just going to alert a server error has occurred and break. Now, I'm not going to fill in other status codes for now, but you get the idea. You can fill in other status codes if you want to handle them in different ways. And at the end, we'll return promise reject and pass the error to it. This way, it ensures that the error still propagates to the calling code so that we could add additional handling if we needed to, or log it for debugging and so on from wherever we're making the AJAX call. Now, I do want to mention that having alerts here is not a good user experience because it blocks the browser thread. I'm just keeping it simple for this project, but ideally this would be some kind of toast notification, or you would pull in some kind of library or build it from scratch that would essentially show a notification to the user. And I think that's pretty much it for this HTTP.js file. Now we could also add a helper function here, something like get validation errors that essentially parses the errors and returns a nicely formatted object, but we don't need to do that. We'll keep it simple for now. All right, so once we have this, now let's create a module specifically for tasks because we want to have a function to toggle the task completion. So we'll create a new file here called tasks.js. We're going to export async function called toggle task completion. We're going to accept the task ID as well as the button that is initiating this call. And then in here, we're going to try and make the request to the server to complete the task. Now, as you remember, to complete the task, it is a patch request. So we would need to use the patch function on the Axios instance. So we would need to do something like http.patch and pass some kind of URL. So let's create the URL variable here. So const URL equals, and the URL here is going to be tasks/task ID toggle completion. Then, since we are passing the button that is initiating this function, we can disable the button to prevent double clicks. So we can do button disabled equals true, and we can wrap this inside try finally block because it can result in an error. And we can also add the catch block here if we wanted to handle the errors in certain way, but in this case, I don't think we care to do that. So we'll do button disabled equals false if something goes wrong, so we re-enable the button, and we can assign this to a response equals await http patch. And once we get the response, we can return the response data. So we can do return response data. All right, as you notice, we're returning response data here, but if we open the task controller, we are not really returning anything from the toggle completion. In fact, this is just a redirect back. So we need to adjust this to return a JSON response because this will expect a JSON response back and not a redirect. So what we need to do here is that we can simply return response JSON and pass some kind of attribute in here. So we can do something like completed and do task completed at doesn't equal to null. So this way we know if the task was completed or it was marked as incomplete. Copilot was suggesting to pass success true, I think, and I don't like to do those kind of things because a response with the 200 status code already indicates success. So returning a success in a JSON form kind of feels redundant. All right, so once we have that here, let's now go back in here, and we have this function, but we need to add this function or trigger this function from somewhere. And we need to trigger that whenever a button that is being passed here is clicked, which means we need to add some kind of event listener to our button click event. Now, there are multiple ways we can do this. We can either add a class or attribute to our buttons all over our code, and then iterate through all the buttons and add the listener to each one. But that may become problematic if you have dynamic elements where you add new tasks, which has its own toggle icon. If you click on that, it's no longer going to work because the event listener was already added from a loop. So instead of doing that, we're going to use event delegation. And for that, we're going to create a utility file and a utility function to add event listener to any element that we want. That way, it doesn't have to be just a button. We may want to add other kind of event listeners to other elements and so on. So we'll create utils.js. And in here, we'll export function add global event listener, and we'll accept a type, selector, callback, and maybe parent, which will be set to document by default. Now, as I mentioned, instead of looping through the elements and attaching a listener to each one, we're going to attach a single event listener to a parent element and then check if the clicked target matches the selector. So that essentially what event delegation is. That way we have one listener on the document parent or any parent. It doesn't have to be document. We can pass a parent in this function, and we will attach one listener to that parent. And then whenever a child element in there, whatever the selector is, clicked, we're going to match the target to the selector and essentially execute the code for that clicked element. This means that it will also work for new tasks that get dynamically added without a full page reload, like if we had infinite scroll, or maybe we refactored it to have AJAX calls when adding a new task. That way it will automatically work with this type of event listener. All right, so in here, we can do something like parent, add event listener, and we'll add a type, which can be a click. Then we'll try to find the closest target based on the selector. So we'll do const target equals eTarget closest selector. And then if we found the target, we will run the callback on that and pass the event as well as the target. And now we need to call this from somewhere. Now we can call this directly from the app.js and add the global event listener to our toggle buttons, or we can create a helper function that can do that. That way we extract that completely within our tasks.js, so app.js doesn't have to know anything about it. So we'll create and export a function here, and we'll call it something like init task completion handlers. And this will simply call the add global event listener, and it will add the click event listener. And maybe we can either add a class to our toggle buttons, or we can just add a data attribute. So we can do something like data task toggle. We need to pass a callback. This will be async, and we get event and button. And then in here, we'll do event prevent default, and we need to execute the toggle task completion function in here. So we need to do something like await toggle task completion and pass the task ID and the button. The button we already have, but we need to get the task ID. So let's do const task ID equals, and we can get the task ID from the button doing something like button dataset task ID, and we'll adjust the blade template to make sure that we can get the task ID properly and our buttons have this data task toggle and so on. We also need to mark that toggle button as completed. So when you click the toggle button, we will execute this, and once we get a success response, we need to update that toggle button with the checkbox, right? It now is going to be checked. If we click on a completed task, then it needs to be unchecked. So we need to essentially make that change manually here because we're not doing the page reload. So we can do that by getting the container that is closest to that button. So we can do container equals button closest and get something like data task item. And after this, we need to do something like, if we have the container, we need to mark its dataset completed to the completed value that we get from here. Remember, this returns the data here, so we could essentially assign this to a variable like this. Completed equals this, and then if we have the container, we can do container dataset completed equals completed. Now, I'm not an expert in JavaScript, so there might be better ways of doing this, but this is how I remember doing it in vanilla JavaScript. I don't really write vanilla JavaScript a lot in recent days. I work mainly with React, but I think this should work. All right, so now the only thing we need to do is we need to call this in our app.js to initialize it. So in here, we'll just do init task completion handlers, and that's pretty much it. And I think we can really get rid of this bootstrap entirely. If we go here, the only thing we really need is the Alpine here. So we can move this in the app here like this, window Alpine and Alpine start like that. And we essentially no longer need the window Axios. So we can just get rid of this file entirely. All right, so the only thing left is to update our blade templates. So let's open dashboard blade template, and we need a completion element, and I think that is within the task list. So we need to open the task list component. So in here, we have this form that handles the task completion. In here, instead of using JavaScript to manipulate the classes and swap SVG content here and so on, we're going to use Tailwind's group and group data selectors. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to find the parent or the container element of this and add the class group to it, and as well as the data task item and the data completed. And the parent container here is either the div element here or the list item. And overall, the main container of the task item is this list item. So we could add it to the list item. So I'm going to add the group here in the list of class. Then we're going to add the data task item. And we also need to add the data completed attribute, and this is going to be set by default to the value that we have from the task variable. The next thing that we need to do after we've set up the container properly, if we go back here, so we have the container set properly, and this will work as well because now we have the completed being updated properly. We need to add the task ID data attribute to the button. So let's go here, and in the button we can do data task ID equals to task ID. We also need to add the trigger data attribute, right? And that is data task toggle. So we need to add that to this button because we want to make this button be the trigger button that triggers that event and the listener. So we'll do data task toggle. And this should work. Now we can replace the type submit to type button. We can get rid of the form entirely because we no longer need it. And this should ideally work. Now we will adjust the SVG properly because we want to make sure that we are displaying the proper UI. Before, when we were clicking on the complete, it was doing the full page reload and this task was no longer included in the list. So we could either do the same in the JavaScript and remove that task from the list entirely, or we can update its UI and cross it out and maybe change the icon or something like that. Kind of what we do on the tasks page. So if we go back to the browser, and we go to tasks, when we toggle the completion, as you can see now we're getting the JSON response because it is no longer redirecting us back. But if we go back and refresh, we see that we are changing the icon here and we are crossing it out. So we may want to do the same thing on the dashboard. So let's actually see if this works. Now it's not going to change the UI because we haven't updated that, but at least we can see if that works. So we click that. The request went through and we got 200 response. And if we open the response, we see we're getting completed true. That means if we inspect element on this, we have the data completed updated to true. And seems like it's working as expected. Now, if I refresh, this is going to be gone from here. And sure enough, it is. So now we just need to adjust the UI so that when we click this, it's going to cross this out and update the UI. So let's go back here. And this is the empty circle, essentially, the task that hasn't been completed yet. So we want to have another SVG here that is showing the checkmark SVG. So we need to copy that from the task blade. So let's open the tasks index, I believe. And let's find this SVG, and probably would be wise to maybe make this into a reusable component. But for now, let's just search that. So yeah, we have, if it's completed, we're showing this SVG. If not, we're showing this. So we're going to copy that and put it here. And then later we could extract it into a reusable component if we wanted to. So we need to show another SVG here. Now we're going to control whether it's hidden or shown using Tailwind. To do that, we're going to add a class here called group data, and then we're going to make it depend on the completed equals to false, and the other one is going to depend on completed true. If it's completed false or completed true, we want it to display as block, and otherwise we want it to be hidden. So we'll just have both of them hidden by default. Then this will handle the proper SVG icon display. The other thing is we want to cross out the title, right? So to do that, we can add the similar class to this title. So we go here and we can do something like group data completed equals true, and we'll do line through. Now, if we save and go back to the browser, we see that the checkboxes are completely hidden. I think that's because we're casting this to Boolean and it's just not setting the proper true or false value to this data attribute. It needs to be a string, so we'll do true or false this way. And I think that's going to fix it. So if we save it and go back, yeah, so now we have these back. If I click this, now it's supposed to update this icon and it's supposed to cross that out. So we click that, and sure enough, that works. Now if we click it again, it works as well. So what's happening here is that the group class that we added to the container establishes essentially a group context for the child elements. Then whenever we toggle the task, if we inspect elements, this data completed attribute gets set to true. And then when this is true, we are either showing or hiding different SVGs, or we are striking through this title when needed. And these buttons are kind of aligned in a weird way. Let me see what the class is. It is item start. I think this should be item center, maybe? If I remove this, yeah, I think this looks better. So we'll go back and remove that and go back here. And yeah, it looks much cleaner this way. Now, another option is we could make this align with that, but I'm not going to do that for now. All right, so now we need to do the same thing on the tasks page. So that way this doesn't do the full page reload. Well, in this case, it no longer does full page reload because we updated the response to be JSON, but we can update this on the UI as well. So if we go here, we can open the index for the tasks. We need to get rid of the form. So we'll get rid of this form. We'll move this in here. We need to add it to its container, which is the table row here. So we'll do class equals group data task item data completed, and this will be the same thing, task completed at, if it is true, otherwise false. Then we need to hide the SVGs by default, and we need to show both SVGs, so I'm just going to remove these, and we'll just control its visibility based on the tailwind group. So group data completed equals false, block, and the same thing here, completed equals true. Then we need to add the task toggle here. So data task toggle and data task ID. Task ID. This type will be button, not submit. And let's wrap this in double quotes, and I think we're good. The other thing is we need to make this crossed out when it's completed. So we will add it to here. Instead of doing the line through this way, we will do group data completed true line through. Let's go to the browser, and seems like it's the other way around. Oh, I think because this is the checked and this is the circle, it's the other way around. So this should be true and this should be false. If we save and go back, yeah, now it's correct. So now if I toggle this, as you can see, it correctly gets toggled and so on. Now, we could, of course, further improve this code by extracting some of these into reusable components, but I would leave that for you as an exercise if you want to do that on your own. Another exercise that you could try is the delete option here. If we inspect element, you will see that we are rendering the form for each delete button here. And we can easily refactor this to use the same Axios instance that we did for the toggling. We would just need to update the controller method to return the proper JSON response, or maybe in this case, even no response at all, because if it's deleted, it's a 200 status. If it's not deleted, then you would respond with the proper error status code. And then in JavaScript, we would check if it's a successful 200, then we just remove this from the table list. The pattern is pretty much the same thing as with this. We have the global event delegation helper function that we could reuse for this delete. So you could add event handler whenever the delete buttons are clicked anywhere. You could specify the container for it instead of the default document container. You could specify this table, for example, and it would only handle clicks for the delete buttons within this container and nowhere else. Now, I'll probably refactor this myself behind the scenes, but it will be available in the GitHub repo. All right, so the Claude code has finished refactoring our delete buttons, and let's see if it did a good job. So we have a lot of changes in here, and the reason for that is because I prompted Claude to essentially create a JavaScript file for each page, because it was trying to stuff everything into the app.js, and there is no reason to load all of these things on every single page. This way, we can have a JavaScript file for each page, like the one for dashboard, for categories, for tasks, and only load the things that we need. Because as you can imagine, you may want to refactor other parts to use JavaScript as well, and you don't want to load all of those things up on every single page. And then Vite handles that really well, because we can specify the JavaScript files in here and then load them in each individual files. So here, for example, in the app layout, it added a stack scripts here, and then I assume it's pushing the files from other pages. So we have the categories, and it's probably, yeah, it's doing the push scripts, and it's pushing the categories index JavaScript here, and so on. And I think that's fine. There are better ways of doing this, but for a vanilla JavaScript and a Blade View template, I think this is okay. I probably would have put the stack scripts in the head and not in the end of the body, since the Vite adds the type module anyways that makes them deferred. So it doesn't really need to be in here. So I would probably move this out of here into the end of the head here. And let's see what else it did. So it removed the init task completion handlers from here, and I assume it put this inside the tasks index and in dashboard. Yeah, so it put it here along with the init task delete handlers and also in the dashboard. Then for the categories, we have the init category delete handlers. And then for recurring tasks, we have the recurring delete handlers, and all of those are being loaded from the tasks.js. Now, I would have probably done this a little differently, but since we only have a few, I don't think it's a big deal. So let's investigate how it did it. So we have the init delete handlers, and all of them seem to use the same function, which is good. So it's reusable. It's passing a selector for the button. It's passing the URL builder, looks like. So it's the URL essentially where it needs to make the delete request. So it's passing the row selector to remove the row from the table. So let's see how this is implemented. So we have the same global event listener on click. We are confirming with the user if they're sure they want to delete this item. We're getting the ID from the data ID attribute. We're getting the URL, we're calling the delete resource, passing the URL and button, and if it was deleted, we get the closest row selector and we remove it from the DOM. And I think that's pretty straightforward. For delete resource, it's disabling the button, making the HTTP delete request, and returning true or returning false otherwise, and re-enabling the button. There was one other thing that I added, and that is for the HTTP client here. In here, I added these get error messages and added support for 403 and 404 in case user doesn't have permission. We want to show some kind of message, right? So we will display you do not have permission to perform this action. For 404, the requested resource was not found. And we can add other status codes here if we wanted to. That way, if the status is not part of the list that we define here, we just show an unexpected error has occurred. All right, so I think we can test it out. It also updated the controllers appropriately. So yeah, they don't return anything, which is expected. The controller, same. I would have probably done something like return response no content. It just makes more sense to me, so I'm just gonna do it this way. And do the same thing in here, and update this, and update the task controller as well. And I think we can test it out. So we are going to refresh the page. Let's test this part out. That works. Let's refresh, make sure it does. Let's now try to delete this. We get the prompt, and sure enough, it gets removed. If we refresh, it is gone. Let's try to delete the recurring tasks. So we'll delete this one, and that works. Categories, let's try to delete this one. We're getting a server error has occurred. So let's see what we get. We can actually inspect the errors directly from here. So we get the 500 internal server error, and the error is related to a foreign key. So we're trying to delete a category that is associated with tasks or recurring tasks. And I think that is expected. We should probably have a handling for that and maybe not allow a deletion of a category that has recurring tasks. Or if we delete a category, we should set everything else to null. So maybe what we can do is, let's see what the constraints are on the recurring tasks table. So we don't have a set null on delete here, which I think we can add as a new migrations. So let's create a migration file. We'll do PHPArtisan make migration, add cascade null on delete to tasks and recurring tasks tables. Okay, so let's open that migration, and we'll simply do table tasks and do this null on delete. And this is of course not going to work because we already have the foreign key. So first we'll drop the foreign key. So we'll do drop foreign key tasks user ID foreign. I don't know if that's the name, but we can just pass the column name, I think, and that should work. And then add the foreign key from the beginning. And we'll do the same thing for the recurring tasks. So we'll do recurring tasks and drop the foreign key and recreate it with null on delete. And I don't think we need the down method for this. All right, let's try to run PHPArtisan migrate, and it's failing because column already exists. Oh, because it's creating the column here. So instead of recreating the column, we need to do foreign category ID references ID on categories, and then we'll do null on delete. Let's do the same thing here, and I think that should work. Now this is going to fail because it already dropped this foreign key, so if we run it, it's actually going to fail and say that it cannot drop the category ID because it doesn't exist. So we can either run the fresh, or I can comment this out, run it, and it's gonna work, and then I'll comment it out. And now we should no longer get that error when deleting the category. So if we go back and go to categories and try to delete this category, we see that it works. And now any tasks or recurring tasks that are associated with that category will simply become null. Now, if you wanted to retain the category reference, you would just add the soft deletes. All right, so I think it's working pretty well. We've refactored the delete from categories, tasks, and recurring tasks to use Axios instead of full page reloads and the form submission. And speaking of refactorings, I think it's time that we clean up our code properly. If you look at our controllers right now, they're doing quite a lot. Let's take a register method in the auth controller as an example. This method is handling the HTTP request, it's validating the input, it creates the user, hashes the password, dispatches an event, and logs the user in. The controller essentially is mixing HTTP concerns with business logic, making it harder to reuse and test. And this is just an example. We have this kind of code all over the code base. We have it in the task controller, we have it in the category controller, and so on. And initially, that's fine as you're writing and validating your idea and your code to simply test it out to see if your pages load, if the functionality works. But at some point, you need to pause and look at it and decide if it's doing too much and maybe it's time to extract into something else so that it's easier to maintain later on. This is perfectly fine for a small app, but as your application grows, you will find yourself wanting to reuse this logic. What if you need to register users from an API endpoint in future, or maybe from an artisan command that imports users from CSV? You would end up duplicating code or awkwardly calling controller methods from other places, or then you would decide to extract this into a trait or something like that and try to reuse it everywhere. There are other ways that we can do this now and without doing a lot of refactoring. And I'm not going to tell you which way is right or wrong. It could be argued that with the LLMs and AI right now doing a lot of the coding, it may not be as important to do such refactorings at a larger scale. However, I still like to keep the code clean because I'm the one maintaining it at the end, even if I'm using LLM or AI as an assistant. As I mentioned, there are multiple ways to refactor this. You can refactor it using services, you can refactor it using other types of classes, or you can refactor it using action classes. So, what is an action class? Think of an action as a single, well defined operation. It takes some input, does one thing, and returns a result. If you've used functional programming, this might sound familiar. It's essentially wrapping a function in a class to get the benefit of object-oriented programming and dependency injection. For example, we can extract some of this logic from registering the user here in a register user action class. It can take the registration data as an input, it can create the user, and return the created user. The main reason to use actions or any other pattern like the service class is to slim down your controllers. Controllers essentially become simple request handlers. They validate, call an action or a service, and then return a response. The same action or the service can then be used in other places like console commands, queued jobs, and so on. Extracting business logic into a separate class, like an action class, also provides an easier way to unit test in isolation. You can unit test the business logic separately and then also build the feature test, which we'll talk more about later, for the controller. The action classes also provide better readability in a way. Names like register user or publish post, for example, describe the behavior and are sort of self documenting. So instead of talking a lot, let's actually extract this into an action class and see what the action class looks like. So we're going to actually create a class using the command. We can either create it manually or use a command. So we'll do PHP artisan make class and we'll put it under the actions directory and we'll put it under auth because we want the register and some other actions to go under the auth directory. We'll call it the register user. And as you can see, the class was created under the actions auth directory. Let's open that up here quick. And let's create a method here that's going to execute our action. Now, the name of the method doesn't really matter much. Some developers use the method execute. Some try to stay consistent within the Laravel conventions and use the method handle. And some use the PHP's magic invoke method to make the class callable like a function. It is up to you which way you want to go about it. I personally prefer to have a method called execute. So I'm going to add the method called execute here. All right, so now going back here, we're going to copy this part and this part and take it and put it here. Now, the first thing that we want to do is that we want to accept the validated data, right? So we can maybe just accept data here and replace this way. And then in here, we will inject the register user action in the method. Now we can inject it in the method or we can inject it in the constructor, but since register user is only going to be used within the register method in this controller, it makes sense to use the method injection rather than the constructor injection. So we'll do register user, and then we'll do register user execute, pass the validated data, and assign this to a user. We'll just need to make sure that we're returning the user here. Great, it is already looking much cleaner. We can in fact take this and put it directly here and make it even cleaner. Now, while we're doing such refactorings, I also want to refactor some of these things to use dependency injection. Instead of using facades like the hash make and helper functions like event, we can inject the actual services that Laravel uses under the hood through the constructor and use those services directly. So let's add the hasher contract in here. So we'll do private read-only hasher, and we'll replace this with hasher, and everything else should work the same way. We can do the same thing for the event. So we can do something like private dispatcher from the events contract, call it dispatcher, and we'll simply do this dispatcher dispatch new registered user. Great, so we've essentially gotten rid of the facades and replaced it with the dependency injection. Now you don't have to do that, you could use facades if you wish to, but in most cases I prefer the dependency injection. The main reason being that it tells me clearly in the constructor of each action and the class what are the dependencies that I have for this class, instead of digging through the code and understanding what facades it's using and so on. Now, throughout this project, I've been using facades and helper functions to sort of show you what the standard or the Laravel way is. However, you don't have to always follow that and use the facades or the helpers. If you prefer the dependency injection, it is there and it's super simple to use. So I prefer the dependency injection in most cases, so I'm going to refactor while I'm doing the refactors in most places to also use the dependency injection. So we'll add the read-only modifier here to the class, and let's talk about the single responsibility of this class. Now, you might wonder if dispatching an event inside the action class here violates the single responsibility principle. It technically doesn't. The action's responsibility is to register a user, the complete business operation of whatever that entails, not just insert a database row in the user's table. Hashing the password, creating the record, and notifying the system are all part of what registering a user means in our application. Now, of course, we could extract some of these further, like if we had some complex logic into hashing a password, we would extract that into a separate thing, because then this business logic would be dealing with two separate things. We're registering the user and we're also performing this complex logic to hash the password. But as you can see, we're already kind of doing that. We're injecting the hasher implementation in the constructor, and we're using that to hash our password. Same goes for the event, and same goes for other fields here. If we were doing something complex with any of the fields like the email, maybe we were doing some kind of extra validation of the email and so on, we could extract that into something else and call that from here. That way, this register user is not responsible for specific business logic of what happens with that email field. This register user action is responsible for simply creating the database record and dispatching an event, essentially just registering the user. It doesn't care how the password is hashed, it doesn't care how the email is set, and it doesn't care how the event is dispatched. We technically could even remove this. I think I've mentioned this before because we are using the casting on the user model. We are casting the password to hashed, and Laravel handles this behind the scenes and it will hash it for us. So we could get rid of this and it would still work. But I personally like to be explicit anyways, and I prefer to do it this way. Another thing is if we moved the event dispatching into a controller, for example, then it will become more complicated because every caller would need to remember to dispatch this event. So if we used the register user action from, let's say, a command or somewhere else, we would need to make sure to remember to dispatch the registered event from there as well. And someone could forget, and then whatever listeners are attached to this registered event wouldn't be executed because we forgot to dispatch this event. If you, for example, didn't want to dispatch event from different places, like maybe you wanted to use this action class in a setter or some kind of command that creates users without dispatching events, then you could essentially extract this part into another action called create user. And then you would have the register user that uses the create user action, and you would call the create user here, and this would dispatch the event. But in our case, we don't have that necessity, so we can keep it inside this register user. I would consider that over engineering unless you really have the need for it. Now, another thing that you might have noticed is that we are accepting an array here. And this is what I call magical array. We are essentially assuming that this data contains an element with the key name, with the key email, and with the key password. Otherwise, this would fail. In most cases, this is fine, but ideally, we would want to use something called data transfer objects or DTOs, which is a simple class with typed properties. It could be something like register user data, and it would have name, email, and password in it. And password property would, of course, have the sensitive parameter attribute. But again, for a small app like this, arrays work fine. If you find yourself passing the same data around to multiple actions or in multiple places and you want stricter validation, then I would consider introducing DTOs. Now, I want to go back to the dependency injection versus facades discussion. As I mentioned before, facades, helper functions, and dependency injection are all okay and they work. It is fine to use either one. However, dependency injection does have some advantages other than what we already discussed. For example, I already mentioned that having dependencies injected like this gives you explicit dependencies. It tells you what class depends on. Another benefit is you're kind of moving away from being too dependent on the framework. Now, of course, it's fine to be dependent on Laravel because we are using Laravel framework and we're using model and the create method in such a way. So we're not really building an application to be fully independent from Laravel as a framework. But having something like this, the action class doesn't know anything about the facades, doesn't know anything about the helper functions, it doesn't know anything about the hasher or the dispatcher. All it knows is that it needs a class that implements the hasher interface, and it needs a class that implements the dispatcher interface. Now, do we have to inject everything? The answer is not really. It is really up to you how much you want to use the dependency injection versus the helpers and the facades. Personally, I would recommend to just stay consistent. If we go back to the auth controller, we've refactored the register method to use the action class. But we're still using the auth facade here. We are using the redirect helper function and the route helper function and so on. We can technically inject the necessary dependencies and use those and get rid of the facade and the helper functions from here. Like I said, you don't have to inject everything. Using the auth facade, the redirect helper function, and the route function here are perfectly fine. The controller isn't something that you would write a unit test for. You would most likely write a feature test for it. And it's not something that you would use or reuse outside of Laravel. It's really about preference and the team conventions. The important thing here is focusing on the dependency injection on the business logic like actions and services where it provides the most value. However, in this instance, I'm going to refactor these to also use the dependency injection because that's my personal preference. So we're going to go to the constructor here. Let's create a constructor and we're going to inject the auth manager, redirector, and the URL generator. So we'll do private read-only auth manager. We'll do private read-only redirector, and we'll do private read-only URL generator. Let's scroll down here and let's replace this. So this will be this auth manager login. This will be this redirector intended, and this will be this URL generator route. We could probably shorten these out a little bit. So instead of auth manager, maybe we could call this auth, and instead of URL generator here, we could call this URL. Yeah, let's do that. So we'll do auth and we'll do URL. Let's format the code here and let's clean this up a little bit. And let's scroll down and update it here. So this will be auth login and URL route. And I think this looks a lot cleaner. Now notice that the controller doesn't know anymore how users are created, and it doesn't really care about it either. It doesn't care how passwords are hashed or what events are fired and so on. It simply now just coordinates the flow. It is doing the controller's job. It's taking the request and it's passing it down to a business logic class, getting the return, and preparing the response to send it back. We could argue that the login part would make sense to be extracted into its own action class as well. And I would agree with that. It would make sense to have something like a login action past the user, and it would just be a simple action class since we would only be extracting one line. For now, I'm going to keep it this way, but we may decide to extract this into its own action class as well. Now let's try to reuse some of these dependencies that we added here. Let's also get rid of the view helper function and instead inject the view factory and use that. So we'll do private read-only factory from the illuminate contract view, and we'll call it view. Then in here, we can do this view make and do the same everywhere else. Let's add the proper return type here. Let's use this redirector to. We could also extract this into the logout action, but for now, I'm going to keep it here. Let's also change this to this redirector back, and we can change this to this auth attempt and this to this redirector intended. Now, you might be wondering how actions differ from the service pattern that you've probably seen in other Laravel projects or something that maybe you've used in your own projects as well. The main differences are that the actions are sort of self-contained. It's like a single purpose operation. They might use Eloquent or other framework features, but they represent internal business logic of one process or one unit. Think of verbs like register user, publish post, send invoice, and so on. The service class, on the other hand, is a class that can have multiple related operations. It can group related functionality together. It can also be used when wrapping around external dependencies or third-party packages, or APIs, where you essentially need a class to interact with something outside of your application. An API, a payment gateway, a file storage provider are such examples. Services can also commonly implement an interface, so you can swap the implementations whenever you need to. For example, our register user action might use payment gateway service if registration involves charging a subscription fee. The action handles the business flow, the service handles the external integration. So it doesn't mean that if you're using actions, you shouldn't be using services, or if you're using services, you shouldn't use actions. You could use both. You could have actions, you could have services, or you could only use one of them if you wanted to. I personally use actions for single purpose operations, and then I use services to group some functionality or use them for external interactions with APIs, third party packages, and so on. All right, so let's look at another refactoring opportunity within our task controller. If you notice, we're fetching the categories in multiple places. So if we search for the categories here, we see that we're calling it within the edit method. If we search it again, we're calling it on line 41. This is within the index method. We're calling it within the create method, and so on. And we're also calling this from the recurring task controller. So why don't we extract this into its own action class and also talk about caching while we're at it. So first I'm going to create an action class. So we'll do actions, category, get categories. Let's open that. Let's add the execute function here, and this will return an array. And now we need to decide what we want to accept. If we want to do the same thing, then we would pass the request user to it. So we would inject the get categories here, like this, and we would do get categories execute and pass the user this way. And then in here, we would accept the user model and then simply do something like this. And this would work and it's perfectly fine. However, if you don't want to pass around the models and instead you want to pass around the user ID, that can also work. We could simply query the category and check for the user ID there and get whatever we need to get that way. It is up to you how you want to handle that. In some cases, I don't like to pass around entire models, like entire user model, when I only really need the user ID from it. Yes, it's convenient to just get the categories relationship this way, but all we really need is the user ID. So we can do user ID and then simply do something like category where user ID, user ID. And this essentially does the same thing. We can format it nicely this way. And another thing that I like to do sometimes, even though the clicking through the category where works here, if it doesn't work for your ID, you can do query and then call where on it. To me, this looks cleaner because that way I can put the where on its own line and not have to have it next to the category. It's just a personal preference, but either way works. We can get rid of the constructor here because we don't really need to inject anything. And now we can simply use the get categories in task controller, recurring task controller, or whatever we need to get the list of categories. Now, I mentioned caching, so let's talk about caching and why it's important. Caching is essentially one of the most effective ways to improve applications' performance. The basic idea is simple. Instead of computing or fetching the same data over and over again, we store the result and reuse it until something changes. So right now, if we call this execute method from task controller, from recurring task controller, from multiple places, we are keep on fetching and executing the same query to get the same list of categories. And categories are kind of things that don't really change that often. User may initially add 10, 20, or 30 categories and then forget about it and start working on tasks. So there is really no need to constantly be querying the categories table to just get simple list of categories for the user. This is where caching could help. Instead, we would query the table one time, store it in a cache, and then on every subsequent request, we would pull it from the cache. Laravel provides a unified API for various cache backends. Out of the box, Laravel supports file-based cache, database, Redis, array, and so on. Array is used for in-memory cache that is very useful for things like testing, or if you want to cache something for a short period of time in the current request or the process. Let's check our current cache configuration. So we'll open the cache.php from the config directory. We have the cache store as the environment variable. The default is set to database, which is fine for our local development for now, but we could update this to Redis if we wanted to by adding the cache store environment variable. In fact, let's see what's in the env file. So cache store is also set to database in this case. Now, how do we interact with the cache? Laravel provides several ways to interact with it. The most common is the cache facade. So we could do something like, and I'm going to open the Tinker here, so we'll do PHPArtisan Tinker. So we could do something like cache put and pass the key and then some value, and we can say how long we want this cache to last. We can pass the carbon instance something like now add minutes, say 60, and this is going to put this key with the value for 1 hour. Now if we do cache get key, this is going to return value. We can also pass a default value in case the key isn't set. So let's say cache forget key, which means it is going to remove the key from the cache. Then we'll try to get the key again. It will return null, but we can say if it's not set, give me some default value, and we get default. One other method that you will often use is the remember method. Remember method essentially allows you to get the cached value for the specific key, and if it doesn't exist, it is going to run the closure that you pass, cache the result, and return it. So for example, we could do something like value equals cache remember key, and we'll say we want to cache this for 1 hour, and we'll pass some arrow function here, and we can execute some kind of heavy method here that takes some time to get the data. For now, I'm just going to return 1 and press enter, and we get the value 1 instead of null, because what happens is that the key doesn't exist in the cache, therefore it executes this closure, gets the result, caches it for 60 minutes, and returns the value. Now if we try to get the key, we get 1. So the remember method is what we're going to use for the get categories action. So let's close this up, and in here we're going to do something like cache remember. We need to specify the key. Since we have the user ID, we want to make sure that the key is unique for the user, because we don't want to show the user and other users categories, for example. That would be not so good. So we can specify the key this way: categories.user.user ID. We can cache it for 1 hour, and again we can either pass the carbon instance or we can pass number of seconds, and we can pass the closure here like this, and this should work. We can technically convert this to arrow function. So as you can see, we are trying to get the data, the list of categories from the cache using the categories user ID. If it doesn't exist in the cache, we're going to execute this closure, get the categories from the user, and cache it for 1 hour, and then return that value. Now, this works until we need to clear the cache. When a user creates, updates, or deletes the category, we need to somehow invalidate this cache, because otherwise it will constantly be getting the same stale categories list for 1 hour until it expires. That means we need to clear the cache from the create category, delete category, and update category actions. The problem is the logic of caching, especially the cache key, is buried within this get categories action. And we would be forced to kind of duplicate this across the other actions as well to clear the cache. And that kind of crosses the boundary of the action having to deal with too many things. Now, it might be perfectly fine for a small app or a simple action like this, but I personally don't like to do that. Instead, I would prefer to extract the caching key logic as well as the remember method into a separate dedicated class. And this is where a service class would make sense. We could have a category cache service class that handles the caching, the key generation or creation, and all of that related to caching the categories or forgetting the category cache. And that way, the get categories action doesn't need to worry about any of that, doesn't need to worry about how to create the proper key for it. The delete category action doesn't need to remember how to reconstruct the same key to make sure we're deleting the proper cache and so on. So let's create a class, a service class to be exact. So we'll do PHP artisan make class services category cache service. Let's open that. And in here, we're going to create the method called remember, and it will essentially do the same thing. Now, the one thing that we didn't refactor here is that we are using the facade, but we could inject the cache manager in the constructor and use that instead. But since we are refactoring this to a dedicated service, we'll do that in here. So we can inject the cache manager here, private read-only cache manager cache, and we can actually make this read-only. Let's get rid of that. And we'll do public function remember, pass the user ID, the closure, and return an array. And in here, we'll simply do this cache remember categories user ID for 1 hour, execute the callback. Now, instead of hard coding this here, we can extract this into another method. We can call maybe something like this key or this get key and pass the user ID. So we'll do public function get key and return this. Now we'll go back to the get categories action and we'll inject that cache service in here. So we'll do construct private read-only category cache service and do something like this. Now we don't need to pass the key anymore because that is delegated to the remember method. It knows how to get the proper key. We just pass the user ID and we pass the callback. Now if we wanted to customize the duration of the cache, we could add that as another parameter and pass it as an argument here. But in our case, we don't really need to do that. Now it's underlining here stating that return value is expected to be an array string returned. That's probably because of the generics here. So to fix that, what we can do is we can add a doc block for the closure. So we can say something like this closure will return an array. And that should fix it. Yep. Now we need to clear this cache when the category is created, when it's deleted, and updated. So let's actually extract one of those methods into its own action class. So we'll open the category controller, and we'll maybe extract the store method, which creates the new category. So in here, we'll do something like create category action, and we'll call the execute method. So we'll do execute, pass the category data. So we'll take this, pass that in, and we'll take this and extract it into an action class. So let's create that. We'll do PHP artisan make class actions category create category. Let's import that. Go here, create the execute method, and simply do this. Now we have the category data, but we don't have the user model. So we need a second argument here. We can accept the user model, or we can accept again the user ID. In some cases, like I said, I prefer the user ID approach. In some cases, I prefer the model approach. The reason I prefer the model approach here is because I can call the create method on the categories relationship and just pass the category data to it. Another way would be to just accept the user ID, and we would just create the category this way. So we would do new category, and then we would associate with the user by simply setting the user ID equals to user ID, and then we would fill the rest and do category save. But this is simpler, so passing the user model here does make sense. So we'll get rid of that, and we'll simply do user categories create. Now in here, we just need to pass the user this way. Now the create method doesn't really need to return anything because in the controller we don't need it, but it doesn't hurt to return the category model from here. So we can simply do return. That way, if we call this from somewhere else, we can return the proper category model. Now let's inject the category cache service in here, and let's clear the cache because we are creating the category. So we would do something like private read-only category cache service, and here we would assign this to a variable, and then we would do this category cache service forget or clear and pass the user ID. Let's create this method in here, and since we have a way to get the key, that should be pretty simple. We can simply do this cache forget this get key ID, and we can return the boolean value of that. And here we can finally return the category. As you can see, the caching logic, including the caching, the clearing the cache, and the cache key, live in one category cache service place. Actions don't need to know or care about how the key is constructed for the cache, or how to properly clear the cache, or how to properly cache the data for the duration, and so on. They simply know that we have the category cache service, and they need to call the necessary methods. Now, while this works fine, we are essentially only clearing cache from within this create category action. What if category is created, updated, or deleted from somewhere else? Let's say that we added the update and delete actions, and then we added the cache clearing there as well. That would be fine. But what if the category gets created, updated, or deleted from somewhere else? We would have to remember to clear the cache from those places as well. Wouldn't it be nice for Laravel to sort of know when updates on models are done and perform some logic like clearing the cache for us? We could trigger something like category updated event from various places and have a listener that clears the cache. And actually, Laravel does have something like that. Laravel already triggers model lifecycle events when they are created, updated, deleted, or even before they are created, as they are being created, and so on. It also provides a way for us to hook into these events and attach some logic to execute as models go through its lifecycle. There are a few ways we can listen on such events. One way is by defining our custom events, and then in the model, like the category model, we can add a property called dispatches events. And in here, we can pass the model's lifecycle events as the keys like created, updated, and deleted, and then map them to the custom events that we create. And then we can have custom listeners that accept those custom events in its handle method, and it will all work. Another way is by using closures within the booted method of the model. So essentially, if we didn't go this way, we could do something like booted, and then in here, we could just do static created, or static deleted, or static creating, or static deleting, and so on. And then within that, we would pass the callback and put the logic that we want, which is fine for one-off events like that, but this booted method can become quite cluttered when you're trying to hook into multiple events and have like quite complex or long logic that you want to execute for those events. And Laravel does have yet another way of handling this, which is called observers. We can have an observer on the model, which essentially listens on many events on the model and allows you to not clutter up your model with a bunch of event logic in here. So let's create an observer for the category model. So we'll do PHP artisan make observer, category observer, and we'll specify the model category. It created this under the observers directory. Let's open that. And as you can see, by default, it has defined the lifecycle events of the model. We have the created, updated, deleted, restored, and force deleted. There are some other methods that you can define, like creating, updating, deleting, and so on. The creating and created events will dispatch when model is saved for first time. Updating and updated events are dispatched when existing model is updated. There is also another event saved or saving, which are dispatched when model is either created or updated, even if nothing was changed on the model. And as you probably guessed, the events in the past tense, like updated, saved, or deleted, are dispatched after the changes on the model are persisted, while the updating, creating, saving, deleting, and so on events are dispatched before the changes are persisted. So what I'm going to do here is that we technically only need the created, updated, and deleted events. So we'll get rid of this, and we essentially need to call the clear method on the category cache service. So we'll add the constructor here and inject the category cache service. Let's make it a read-only. And then we'll simply do this category cache service clear and pass the category user ID. And we'll do the same thing here and here. Now we need to register this observer. We can use the observed by attribute directly on the model. So on the category model, we can add something like observed by attribute and specify the observer, category observer. And that's it. Now, whenever a category is created, updated, or deleted, whether from a controller, a command, or somewhere else, the cache will be automatically cleared for the user because of this observer. Now, I personally don't like to clutter my code base with a lot of observers because it kind of hides the logic away. But in this kind of scenarios, it is perfect use because we want to make sure that the cache gets cleared anytime category gets updated, deleted, or created. Now, I do want to note that these events get only triggered when you're using Eloquent. If you're using the query builder and running your own raw queries, it is not going to trigger those events. So in that case, the observer won't work. But when you're using the Eloquent and you're just updating it through Eloquent or creating or deleting, it is going to work. So in that case, we can get rid of this from here and we can remove it from here. All right, now I do want to update this in multiple places. So we had it here, we have it here. So let's do it this way. And in this case, this is where it makes sense to inject the get categories in the constructor because we're using it in multiple places. So we'll do this get categories and this get categories and just inject it in the constructor. So we'll do constructor private read only get categories, and then we'll do the same thing in one more place, I think here. All right, I think that's pretty much it. Let me just double check I passed the right parameters. Yeah, we need to pass the ID, not the user. So let's do the same thing here and here, and that should be it because we're accepting the user ID, not the user model. All right, so now let's test our cache to make sure it's working. So let's go to the browser. Let's log in with the user. Let's open the queries here. We don't have that query yet for the categories. Let's go to tasks. We are executing the query right here. And as you can see, it's inserting the record in the cache because we're using the database driver for cache. Now, if we refresh the table, we see that we're no longer calling that categories query to get the name and the UUID. Instead, we're getting it from the cache. Now, again, we're using the database driver, so we are executing an additional query here, so it's not really that much different. But if we were using something like Redis, this would be getting from Redis and not from database. Now, if we go to the recurring tasks, we see that we are still executing this, but we can update that to also use our action class, which pulls it from the cache first. So now if we go to the categories and we try to delete one of the categories and go to tasks, we see that now it's executing the query again because it was deleted from the cache. And the same would happen if we try to edit this, update, and go back to the tasks. We see that it's calling the same query. We refresh, now it's getting it from the cache. Let's try to create a new category. So we'll do test. We go back to the tasks, and it is now pulling it from the database and then inserting it into cache again. All right, let's look at another pattern that we see repeated that we can extract into an action. So in the task controller, if we go to the store method, we see that we are trying to get the category. If we have the category ID on the request, and then we are checking the access to that category for the user. And this logic is repeated in multiple places. So if we go to the update, we see that it's repeated here, and it is also repeated in the recurring task controller. So I think this is a perfect candidate for an action to kind of standardize this approach because they differ slightly, right? So we'll create a new action called resolve category. So we'll do PHP artisan make class actions category resolve category. Let's open the resolve category. We will create the execute method. This is going to accept the UUID of the category as well as the user model because we want to execute the permission check on that user model. Now, the goal of the resolve category is to return the integer category ID. So we will return nullable integer. The UUID that we are accepting here can also be null, so that way we don't have to do this check in the controllers. And in here, we can simply check if no UUID, we can just return null. Then we can do the lookup, right? We can do this part. So we can take this and put it here. So we'll do category where UUID equals this and get the first record. Then we can do this check right after, like this. So if no category is found or the user cannot access or manage that category, we are throwing the validation exception. Otherwise, if the category is found, we just need to return its internal ID. So now we have this part covered, we have this part covered, we have this part covered, and we just need to figure out these two parts. Technically, we don't need to do this part because we can simply update the category ID on the valid data to be whatever the integer gets returned from here. That way we don't need to associate it manually here, and it will work because we're calling the fill method in here. So we could do something like this: valid data category ID equals, and we'll inject the resolve category action here and simply do resolve category execute task category ID and pass the request user as well. And we can get rid of this whole thing, and this is going to work. Now we can do the same thing in the store method. So we go in here and we can do task data category ID equals this. Let's inject the resolve category here. Let's pass the category ID and the request user. and we should be good. Now, I think I did make a mistake. We need to pass the request category ID, not the task category ID. So going back here, we shouldn't be passing the task category ID because this is a bug. It's essentially just going to be keep on updating the same category ID. And if we change the category, it's not going to persist that change. So we need to get the category ID from the request. We can either do it this way, or we can do string category ID, or we can just get it from the valid data. So we could do something like valid data category ID. Now, if we go up to the store method, we can do the same thing here. We can do task data category ID. And we would do the same thing in the recurring task controller. And I'm not going to update that now. I can do that thing behind the scenes, but you get the idea. Let's test this out to make sure that it works. So we go to the tasks and let's change the category to something like this. Update task. It works. Let's create a new task. Test. Let's set this to this category. Let's set the date, and that works as well. Let's do it one more time. Let's select another one, and that works. Now, actions can also depend on other actions. For example, if we were to extract this into a create task action, we would need to inject the resolve category action within it, because we need to resolve the category and then create the task. So let's create that class. We'll do actions, task, create task. Let's inject that in here. Create task. We will not need the resolve category, and we'll simply do create task, execute, and pass the request validated data to it. Now we can take this and put it inside the execute method. So we'll do it this way. Put it here, and we'll inject the resolve category here. Let's update this, and we'll have array of task data, and we need the user model because we need to pass that to the resolve category. So we'll do user, and we'll take that and pass it here. Now we'll also take that and do user tasks create task data. We're not returning anything here, but we could return the newly created task. And we can simply add the hint here that this is the task model. And as you can see, this is very clean, right? The permission checking of the category and the category resolution to get the internal ID from the UUID is encapsulated in one action. The create task itself doesn't care how the category resolution happens. That is delegated to another action, resolve category. All right, I think Claude Code can handle the rest of the cleanup here and refactorings because it will have a solid start. We refactored some of the main things, and we want to apply the same pattern and same strategy to the rest of the methods in the controllers and rest of the controllers. So in the prompt, I'm simply going to tell Claude that, hey, here are the refactorings that I did. Apply the same strategy to the rest of the controllers. But before we do that, I do want to do some minor refactors as I explain the reasoning behind it. For example, in controllers, you might notice we're extending this controller, the base controller class. If we inspect, it's just an empty abstract controller class. I personally, most of the time, get rid of that because I don't have a need for it. We're not going to fill this out. It's just an empty class, and there is no need to extend it from everywhere. So I'm just going to remove it from this controller and remove it from the rest of the controllers as well. The abstract controller is mainly useful if you want to add some shared traits or functionality to the base controller so that they are available in all the controllers that extend it. But like I said, I personally almost always remove it. The other thing I want to update is within the update task request, we are using the auth facade. And while this is perfectly fine, we can actually get the user by calling this user. because this exists on the form request. If we inspect, we see that it's available on the request object. Again, it's not that one is better than the other, they do the same thing. It's just cleaner to use what's already available rather than reaching for a facade or a helper function and so on. The one other thing I want to call out is that we actually have an invalid HTML. While reviewing the code base, I noticed that we have a div inside a button in the navigation dropdown. So if we open the navigation here, we are using div inside the button, and if we hover over it, we see that we get a warning that element div is not allowed here. So instead, I'm just going to replace it with span. I'll change this to PHP 8.4. I haven't updated mine to 8.5 yet, but 8.5 has been released, so you can update that if you want to. Now, the other thing that I want to call out and refactor is the date formatting. If we look at our current resources, let's look at category resource, we have date format in this format. If we look at the task resource, we have this format, but we are also passing the Carbon instance in certain cases. This essentially pushes the formatting decisions to the views, and each view might format dates differently. The form inputs need another date format, display needs the human readable format, and JavaScript may need another format. So there are multiple ways to handle that. One of the ways that we can solve that is by introducing another resource called datetime resource and extracting that kind of logic into the datetime resource. So we could do something like PHP artisan make resource datetime resource, and then in here we're going to add the constructor. And in the constructor, this is not a standard resource, right? It's not a standard model resource, but we can still use resources like this. We can say that this resource is going to be Carbon interface instance, and we can add another parameter here if we want to include the time as well. So that way we can have date or date time. And by default, include time can be true. Then in the toArray method, we can do something like this. So if the resource is null, we can return an empty array. Otherwise, we can return the format that we want. And here we can return multiple things. We don't have to return or stick to one format. We can return the human readable format, like the display format, for example. We can return the ISO format, and we can also return the datetime format for input fields if we wanted to. Or we can just return a timestamp as another option. So this sort of standardizes all the date times to have standard structure. So that way the front end can use whichever it wants. And you might think that this is overkill, and in some cases it is overkill. You may only need one format for your front end. You may just want timestamp and nothing else, and then do all the things in the front end. But in our case, we'll just pass 3 different values here. We'll do display equals this resource format, and if we need to include the time, we'll use this format, and otherwise we'll use this format. Then for ISO, we'll simply call the method toISO8601 string. And finally, the date time will just be this resource format. If we want to include the time, it's going to be ymdhis, or it will just be ymd. And that's pretty much it. Now in our task resource, we can instantiate the datetime resource and pass our Carbon instance to it, and then call resolve and pass the request. For task date, we don't need to include the time because it's a date column. And we'll do the same things here. So we'll do new date time resource, do it this way, and at the end, we'll just delete the format here and just call resolve request. Now you might be asking, why are we calling the resolve method here? If we try to do this without the resolve, it is going to result in an error in the blade views. When you return a resource from an API endpoint, Laravel automatically resolves all the nested resources as it builds the JSON response. But we're passing the resource data to blade views using the resolve method in the controllers. We're kind of going the non-traditional way. So since we're doing that, the resolve method only transforms the top level resource, and the nested JSON resource instances remain as objects, and therefore it will cause errors in the blade. So we have two options here. We can either resolve the nested resources manually, which is what we're doing here, or we can use the response pipeline to get the data and then access the data element in that array. That way it would go through the Laravel's full response transformation, which would handle the nested responses and so on, but it's more verbose and this works for our use case. Again, if you were using something like React and you were returning the JSON, you wouldn't need to do any of this. This is more of a like, since we're trying to use the resources for the views, we just need to add this in here. Now what's left is that we need to update the front end to properly access these types, because they're no longer just one values, now they're arrays. So task resource is returned within the task index blade, and in here we would need to get rid of this essentially and instead do something like display, and this would work. Now you might notice that we are using the camel case instead of the snake case for the API resources. And the reason for that is because we're not really JavaScript heavy application. If you're in JavaScript heavy application and your team's conventions follow the camel casing on the front end side, then you might want to use camel case in your resources to transform your models into the proper format and send that to the front end. All right, so with the task date update, I think we should be good. The other thing is the completed at, but we're not displaying it here. So I think we should be good from here, but let's double check. I don't remember where else we use this. So we only use it in the tasks index and we use it in the task list. I assume we use the task date here as well. So we'd need to get rid of this and do display. Now, technically, we don't even need the created at, updated at because we're not using it anywhere, but we can keep it there in case we wanted to display the when the task was created or when it was last updated and so on. So let's also search the task date where that's used in the front end. So we have it in the task list, so we updated it here. We have it in the create, which is in the form. We do care for the edit because it's using it right here. So instead of to date string, we're going to use date time. And this will be just a date string because again, we're formatting it without the time in the resource. And I think that's pretty much it. We already updated it in here. So now you might be asking why this specific design? Why are we passing it as an array with 3 different formats? One of the main benefits here is that we don't need to handle conversions in the blade. The datetime value is already in the format that HTML date inputs expect, so we don't need to convert it using the date functions and so on. We also don't need to have mixed return formats here where task date is the full carbon instance and these are formatted into something else. This creates some sort of consistency of what the views get. When we expect the date, they will always get these 3 formats. The ISO is mainly for JavaScript. If we need to manipulate the dates in the JavaScript, maybe apply user time zones or format them differently and so on, the ISO value works perfectly for that, especially with the date object in JavaScript. Now, we're not really using the ISO yet, but this could be useful and come in handy later on. Alright, so I think that's pretty much what I wanted to cover here. I'm just going to prompt the Claude code to help us with the rest of the cleanup, to do the same thing with the date as well, and refactor the controllers to essentially clean up the code and use our existing patterns and strategies that we just did manually so it has a solid ground to do the rest of the cleanup. All right, before we review some of Claude's work, I want to mention a couple of changes I made in parallel while Claude was doing the refactoring. One of the change was in the get dashboard stats action, which essentially the Claude created the action from the controller method, but then I decided to update it to run a single query instead of running multiple queries. So in here, if you remember before, it was running query for each of these metrics, but now it's running a single query to get all of these data in one query. It is simply using the case statement. So we are checking whenever the task date is equal to the today's date, then it returns 1, otherwise it doesn't return anything, and that's the tasks that are for today, and it essentially just counts them up. And then it does the same thing for the other metrics. It checks when the task date is equal to the today's date and the completed at is not null, then those are the tasks that were completed today, so we need to count them up, and so on. The other thing that I updated is the fillable properties on the task and recurring task models. So let me open the task model here. Before, we included the user ID in the fillable property here, and the same in recurring task. We included the user ID here as well. We added this when we built the recurring tasks feature and the command. Initially, we were using the mass assignment create method in that command, and we were passing the user ID. And in order to make that work, we had to add the user ID to the fillable property. We also had to add the recurring task ID to the fillable as well, because we were also passing the recurring task ID to the create method. However, it is not necessary anymore because we later refactored it to use the batch inserts instead of mass assignment create. In addition to it not being necessary, it can also become risky in certain situations. While we are already secure because we only pass the validated properties from the form request into the create or update methods, it's probably best to keep the user ID foreign key out of the fillable property entirely. We create these records using the user model relationship anyway. We're doing something like user tasks create. So we don't really need to ever pass the user ID directly to the create or the update method. Laravel essentially sets the foreign keys properly for us, overriding whatever we passed in the array anyways. However, if for some reason we used the request all and did something like task create and then passed request all to it, we could be at risk. A user could pass someone else's user ID, and because it was part of the fillable property, it would go through. So while you're adding fillable property to protect yourself from mass assignment, and you might think that you're safe to use request all, when you add foreign keys here, that can become problematic. So since we don't really need to keep the user ID in the fillable property, because like I said, we're creating records via the relationship, it is safe to remove it, and that's why I've removed it from the fillable property. And the same applies to the recurring task ID. There was no need for it to be in the fillable since it should be explicitly set by the system. The category ID is kind of in the same boat, but with one difference. We allow the user to select the category. If we want to use the mass assignment create or update methods, category ID has to be part of the fillable property. But we have the protection on that as a separate thing. We have the category ID result action that checks to make sure that category being passed actually belongs to the current user. So we're okay in that sense. All right, now let's look at some of the highlights of Claude's refactoring. Claude refactored the controllers to use action classes and followed the same patterns that we've been establishing throughout the series. So things like extracting logic into dedicated actions, keeping controllers thin, using dependency injection, and maintaining consistency across the codebase. This is actually one of the benefits of working with AI assistants on refactoring. Once you establish a pattern, it can apply it consistently across multiple files without getting tired or forgetting the conventions halfway through. Unless, of course, the context gets overloaded or it starts hallucinating. And it did some cleanup as well on the auth controller, like seems like I forgot to update this route with this URL. And on the logout, I forgot to replace the facade with this auth. So Claude kind of caught that and fixed it up for us. Looks like the build config method was added to the task frequency enum, which is not that bad. Honestly, maybe I would have put it not in an enum, but this is, I think, okay because it is checking if it's weekly or monthly and then checks what keys of the data are set and then based on that returns the proper array structure. Update recurring task action is using the resolve category action, which is great because it's pulling the proper category ID that way and setting it on the data variable. And then it also uses the build config from the task frequency to set the frequency config, removes the days and day of the month from the array, and then fills the data on the recurring task model. And I think that's pretty much it. As you can see, it's pretty straightforward. It essentially just took the controllers and thinned them down by using and extracting stuff into actions. And it also followed the patterns that we've established previously. Now, I'm not going to go through every single file, but instead I want to talk about some of the other more important items. For example, you might be wondering why in the register request, we kept this unique user's email validation rule. Because you're probably thinking that this essentially reveals the information whether an email is registered or not, which has a potential for user enumeration. For login, we talked about some guardrails around that. Laravel uses timebox to prevent timing attacks, but registration openly tells you this email is taken. For most applications, this is fine. Large social media sites and major companies do the same thing, so I don't think it's a big deal. User existence typically doesn't reveal anything compromising, and rate limiting helps in most cases there. However, if your application needs to have stricter guardrails, like sensitive healthcare applications or anonymous services, then your registration form shouldn't validate email uniqueness at all. It should, of course, validate it behind the scenes, but it shouldn't let the user know that this email is taken. Instead, the flow in that case would become something like first step would be to collect all the registration information. The second step would be to always show the same success message to the user, something like check your email to continue. The third step would be checking if the user's email doesn't exist and it's a new account, then you would essentially send a verification link to complete the registration. If the email exists for the user, you would then simply notify the account owner that someone attempted to register with that email address. This way, a potential attacker doesn't learn anything from the registration form. The trade off, of course, is slightly more complex flow and potentially confusing user experience if users forget that they already have an account. We're going to keep our current validation in here since the user existence isn't sensitive for this application. But it's worth knowing the pattern if you ever need it in future. Another thing that I had Claude add was the protection against multiple form submissions. Like when a user double clicks a button or hits the enter twice, that would result in duplicate records. Now, for user registration, we're actually protected by the unique constraint at the database level. It would just reject the duplicate by throwing an exception. But if you're not handling that error gracefully, it would still not be a good user experience. For tasks, categories, and recurring tasks, though, there is no such constraint, so you would just end up with duplicate entries. There are a few ways to handle this. On the front end, you can disable the button after the first click or ignore the rapid repeated submissions. And for a lot of cases, that's good enough. But if you're building an API or dealing with something more critical, like payments or financial transactions, you would want to harden it on the server side as well. That starts getting into the concept of idempotency, which is about ensuring that making the same request multiple times has the same effect as making it once, with approaches like using an idempotency key to track and deduplicate requests. But that's beyond the scope of this project, so we're not going to get into that. In our case, handling it with Alpine.js to disable the button works just fine. We could do it in vanilla JavaScript as well, but I like the Alpine.js approach, which is what I had Claude add. If we go over to some of these blade templates, you will notice that addition in here. So we have the X data with variables submitting false by default, and then on submit, we are setting the submitting variable to true. And then on the button, we're simply showing the button if we're not submitting. And if we are submitting, then we're showing a different text, something like creating task or updating and so on. And if this flag is true, we're simply disabling the button. So as soon as the form submits, the button becomes disabled and it cannot be clicked again. And the reason we're swapping the text here, which is an optional thing, you don't have to do that, it's just to give the user some sort of feedback that something is happening behind the scenes. And then on the button component itself, we just add some Tailwind classes for the disabled state. So let me find the button here, primary button. If we scroll to the right, we see that we are adding the disabled opacity and then disable cursor not allowed. I also updated Laravel Boost to version 2.0 during this process, which is why you will notice changes to the Boost JSON in here and some of the other files. Version 2.0 adds skills system support, which lets you extend and customize the development workflow with additional capabilities that the AI can leverage. And it also comes with improved guidelines overall. So the combination of better guidelines and the skill support means that the AI has a better understanding of Laravel conventions and can produce higher quality code. You can check the documentation for more info on that and what skills are available. Right now, I think it created one skill, yeah, and that is the Tailwind CSS development. And it creates these skills based on what dependencies you have installed. If I was using Inertia, you would create a skill for Inertia and Laravel development, whether it's React or Vue and so on. If you're not familiar with skills or the concept of skills, they're essentially markdown files with instructions and guidelines that tell the AI how to handle specific tasks. The nice thing is they don't all get loaded into context at once. They only get pulled in when they are relevant, so they don't pollute the context window. With that, let's now move on to some code quality tools that I wanted to cover. I want to talk about Pint, PHPStan, and Rector. We're only going to use Pint in this project, but I want you to be aware of all three, even though we're only going to use Pint in here, because they each solve a different problem, and together they form a really solid code quality toolkit that I think every PHP and Laravel developer should use. As your code base grows, and especially when you're working with a team or with AI generated code, you want automated ways to enforce consistency and catch issues. You don't want to be manually reviewing every single file for formatting or hunting down type errors that a tool could have caught for you. Pint is Laravel's opinionated tool built on top of PHP Fixer, and it comes pre-installed with Laravel. What it does is simple. It takes your code and reformats it to follow consistent coding style. things like spacing, indentation, bracket placement, import ordering, simplified returns, and so on. There are plenty of rules that you can check the documentation of the PHPCS fixer and see which rules you want to enable or disable to fit your style and the consistency of your code base. Basically, all the formatting stuff that doesn't change what your code does, but it makes it look clean and consistent. As I mentioned, you can customize the rules, but you can also customize the presets. And Pint comes with multiple presets. It comes by default with the Laravel preset, but you can change that to something like PSR12 or even Symfony if you prefer. By default, it does not require any configuration out of the box, but if you wanted to customize the rules or the presets, you would just have to create the pint.json file. Then to run the Pint, you simply just run something like vendor bin Pint, and this is going to run through the whole thing. Now, before I run this, let's talk about the PHPStan and Rector. PHPStan essentially analyzes your code without actually running it, and it tries to find bugs in that process. We're talking things like calling methods that don't exist, passing wrong argument types, accessing properties that might be null, and so on. It catches entire classes of bugs and code smells before you even write tests. Larastan adds the Laravel specific intelligence on top of that, so it understands things like eloquent relationships, facades, and the other magic that Laravel uses. PHPStan has levels from 0 to 10. You typically start at a lower level, something like 5 or 6, and then gradually increase the strictness as you clean up your code base. We're not using it in this project, but it's definitely something worth exploring as your applications grow. And then there is Rector. Rector is an automated refactoring tool. While Pint handles formatting and PHPStan finds potential bugs, Rector actually transforms and refactors your code. It can upgrade your code base to use newer PHP syntax, new Laravel conventions, apply custom refactoring rules that would take time to do manually. Now, before we run Pint, there are a few configuration settings that I want to make in our Laravel application by updating our app service provider. And by configuration settings, I actually mean things that I want to enable or disable in our application. So let's open AppServiceProvider, and within the boot method, we're going to add a few config settings. These are the things that I would recommend adding to pretty much every Laravel project or application. They're kind of one-liners that go in this boot method, and they can save you from some really subtle and painful bugs down the road. The first one that I like to add is more strictness around eloquent. This method call essentially enables 3 protections under the hood. The first one is preventing lazy loading, which ties directly into the n+1 problem we've discussed before. By preventing lazy loading, Laravel will throw an exception if you try to access a relationship that wasn't eager loaded, which forces you to be explicit about what you're loading up front. The second one is about preventing silently discarding attributes. This one ties back to mass assignment. If you have mass assignment protection enabled and have the fillable property set on your model, and you try to update an attribute that isn't in that list, Laravel simply just silently ignores it. Your code thinks that the data was saved maybe, but in reality it wasn't because Laravel discarded it under the hood. With this turned on, you'll instead get an exception, and you will know why your data isn't persisting because now it's throwing an exception. You could turn off mass assignment globally by something like model unguard, which is something that a lot of devs typically enable here. So they do something like model unguard. And this way you don't need fillable property at all. But as you know, when you do this, you're taking a risk, because without the fillable property, you must ensure that only valid and acceptable columns are passed into methods like create, update, and so on. But as I mentioned before, now with more AI taking over the coding part, I prefer having the mass assignment protection on with the fillable property. Then the third protection here is about preventing access to missing attributes. If you ever use a select statement to only load certain columns from the database and then later in your code you access a column that wasn't loaded, Laravel normally just returns null silently. That might sound harmless, but imagine you're checking a user's subscription status and it comes back null because it wasn't selected. Maybe you forgot to add the subscription column in the select query, and now every single paid user in that query that gets returned is treated as if they're on the free tier. With this protection on, Laravel will throw the exception and you will know that there is something else going on. Now, an important distinction between these three is that the first one, the prevent lazy loading, is primarily a performance concern. Your application still works correctly, it's just making more queries than it should. However, the other two here, they are preventing access to missing attributes and preventing silently discarded attributes. These don't necessarily mean that the application is behaving correctly. They're, in my opinion, some sort of exceptional behavior. We don't want Laravel to silently hide this information from us and try to return null or try to discard these attributes that we're trying to save into the database and so on. Because it could be a bug and we would have no idea that there is a bug. So that essentially raises a question of how do we configure this? Where should this be enabled? In both production and local, or only production, and so on. If you want the simplest approach, you can just call the should be strict like this, which essentially turns on all three everywhere. But as you can see, this one, you can pass an argument here that lets you turn it off on certain environments. So you could do app is production and only turn it on if it's a production environment, but in local you turn everything off. But you may not want to do that, right? As I mentioned, prevent lazy loading I think should be failing locally. I should be getting exceptions. But in production, it doesn't necessarily mean that I want production to fail if we're making extra queries. Instead, maybe I want to do some logging, but I want the application to continue working. The other two, however, I treat those as exceptional items, and therefore I would expect an exception to happen. I don't want the application to continue working if something is being added to the database or something is being updated to the database. I want to make sure I know that there is a bug so that I can go ahead and fix it. So these two I would want to enable everywhere in both production and local. So you have some options here. What you can do is you can just take these three and enable them and disable them in here based on the environment. So you would enable these for everywhere. So you would just pass true. And this one you would only pass true if it's a local environment and not production. If you want to do some logging, then you can actually simply enable it for everywhere by using should be strict. This will enable all three. And then you can call model handle lazy loading violation using and pass a closure that just logs the model and the relationship that was lazy loaded. And therefore, this will be the custom handling of that lazy loading violation instead of an exception. So we can do something like get the class using get class and pass the model, and this closure actually gets the model and relation as arguments here. And then we can just do log it as an info or warning or whatever level you wish to log this. And you could do something like attempted to lazy load relation on model class. Now, something to be aware of here is that when we define the handle lazy loading violation using here. It essentially is going to log this in local environment as well as in production. But that may not always be the expectation. We may want the exceptions to be thrown locally, right? That's why we're adding this to enable it for all environments and throw exceptions always. But in production, we want to log only the lazy loading violation. This just replaces that handling entirely, so it will log locally and in production as well. To get the exception back in local environments, you either register this only when it's the production environment, or you could do something like if app is production, then we will log this and do return, and otherwise we'll simply do throw new lazy loading violation exception, and we just need to pass the model and relation. And now this is just going to handle the whole lazy loading violation for us. For production, it's going to log. For local environment, it's going to throw the exception. In fact, I could probably replace this the other way. So if it's is local, we throw the exception. Otherwise, we will log it. Another useful setting that I like to add here is to disable or prohibit destructive commands. And those are the commands like migrate fresh, migrate refresh, rollback, and so on. Essentially anything that could mess up your database or corrupt your database or drop your tables or things like that. So Laravel actually provides a way to disable those from accidentally being ran in production. Even though you know you're not supposed to run migrate, fresh, rollback, and other commands in production, you or maybe another developer might run it accidentally. In local environments, local development, these commands are fine to run, and you will use them all the time. But in production, they could be really bad and dangerous. So what we'll do here is we'll simply again do app is production, only disable this in production environments. Now if we go here, let's say we disable this for all environments and we did something like PHP artisan migrate fresh, this is going to fail. As you can see, we're getting warning that this command is prohibited from running in this environment. But once we bring this back, then we should be able to run this command. One other setting that I like to add here is the immutable date usage. By default, Carbon that Laravel uses is mutable, which means that if you have a variable that holds a date and you call something like add days and pass number 7, which is supposed to add 7 days to the given date, it modifies the original variable too, which can lead to really subtle bugs, especially when you're passing dates around between methods or building date ranges and so on. By making dates immutable by default, you kind of solve that. So we could do something like date use, and then we pass carbon immutable class, and that's pretty much it. So whenever we call add days or add hours or manipulate the date, it will return a new instance every time instead of modifying the original variable. It's a small change that prevents a whole class of potential date-related bugs. So this pretty much it. I almost always add these settings in most of my Laravel applications. This combined with some like password defaults, the rate limiters, and few other things. While I'm here, I'm actually going to get rid of this dblisten because we don't really need to log every single query since we're using Debugbar in our local environments. So I'm just gonna remove that. So let's now run the Pint to see what changes it makes. So we'll run vendor bin Pint, and actually in order to see the diff, I'm just going to commit all of these. Let's add that, commit, and now we'll run it so we can see what it changes. And as you can see, it made quite a bit of changes, right? It ran through 87 files and 41 style issues were fixed. So now let's inspect, and we see that it removed some of the imports that were not used. It removed some spaces. I personally prefer the spaces here, so I'm just going to adjust the rules so that it keeps these spaces the way I like. Now let's see some of the others. It is not aligning these. So I'm going to create the Pint JSON file here. And I'm going to paste in the conventions that I typically like to follow. So I like to add strict types to everything. As you might have noticed, we haven't declared strict types on any of the classes, but I like to keep those on my PHP classes. So I'm going to enable that so it automatically adds it for me whenever I forget. Strict parameters, void return, concat spacing. This is the one that I was just showing you earlier, and some other rules. Alright, so I think the only things left for our project now are to write some tests and add a simple profile page so that user can update their name, reset password, etc. And then prepare for deployment. The user profile, I'm most likely going to use Claude for that. We might talk about the password reset in there since that's security related. But other than that, updating the user profile should be pretty straightforward. Now, there are also several topics that we haven't covered while building this project that you will eventually run into as you build more complex applications. Things like user time zones. Right now, everything is stored and displayed in UTC, but in real application, you would want to display dates in the user's local time zone. Queues and jobs for handling things like sending emails or processing tasks in the background, file uploads and file storage, working with external APIs using Laravel's HTTP client or building APIs with different types of auth, different mail drivers and building email templates, full text search, and even more advanced search with semantic or vector search. And these are all the topics that we may cover in a separate project-based build series. And in the meantime, Laravel documentation does a great job covering each of these topics individually. But this series should really set you up with the solid foundation, and not just in Laravel, but in how to think about structuring an application, making smart decisions about your code, and working effectively with AI tools to speed up your workflow. With what you learned here, you're well equipped to dive into the docs and start tackling these more advanced topics on your own. So with that, let's write some tests. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy these videos, please hit the like button and subscribe. Until next time, happy coding.